everyone for being here this morning. And I also want to thank the museum, Maria Elena, especially for being a great collaborator on this project, both in the exhibition and also this event. Anita and Adrian for their hospitality and making this possible, as well as Tobias for his confidence in whatever we're doing. And also, of course, the participants, who are all people that I greatly admire and have been looking at their work since I started working on these topics a few years ago. This event is actually part of a larger series of discursive events that I have been organizing since 2012 in relationship to exhibition projects I've been doing in different museums. The first one goes back to the New Museum in New York, where I organized an exhibition called We Who Feel Differently. And it became very apparent that some of the issues concerning sexuality and gender that I was dealing with needed to be activated in real time, dealing with local concerns, with local communities of people. So this is the sixth one of those events. Another one took place at the Tate Modern in London, Vite de Vite in Rotterdam, the Union Theological Seminary in New York, and there is an upcoming one at Malba in Buenos Aires next month dealing with queer theology. So that's just to give you a little bit of a background in terms of where I'm coming from in this organization. The other thing that I wanted to mention was a bit about the exhibition itself. Which is, of course, a large exhibition in a small space. Large in the sense that it brings together many works and many different and complex ideas about the construction of sexuality, focusing on the representation of homoeroticism in pre-Hispanic and pre-Columbian cultures, or speculating around ideas of homoeroticism in those cultures. And also a series of films that depart from specific cases that have been found in colonial archives, which I think is most likely a topic that is going to be talked about a lot today. What does it mean for these kinds of cases to exist within those archives, and how those archives create a sense of criminality and kind of like a liminal space between being an individual and being turned into a case, which is something I will speak about myself later when I give a short presentation. If you have not seen the exhibition, I encourage you to find some time to do it. It's actually just right around the corner here, upstairs. And I welcome you to come back. It's actually an hour worth of videos, so most likely you won't be able to see them all today, but you can come back. Now I want to invite Pablo, who's actually going to give the introduction to this event. Pablo and I met a few years back in Quito during the Queering Paradigms conference. And I was immediately struck by, I will just tell the way that I met you actually. There was a presentation by somebody who made a critical remark in the panel, and Pablo raised his hand and basically trashed this person, completely. And I was so impressed by his sharpness and by, that I actually had to talk to him after. And it came to be that he has been working on colonial archives for a long time, and he actually shed light on the case of Martina, which is one of the characters of my film, Deseos. And he worked on that case for his thesis project at the university. So we've been in touch for a few years now, and it was really a pleasure to be able to collaborate with him on thinking through some of these issues that, of course, he deals in his academic work, and that, in a way, he has also enabled me to approach through my artistic practice. So I'm just going to call Pablo and perhaps the translator. Sorry, I haven't met you yet. And Hernando, thank you. So Pablo is going to speak in Spanish, and Hernando will translate, and then we'll continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Buenos días. Tengo mi pastel. ¿Cuál no leeré? Les damos las gracias por asistir. Bienvenidos, bienvenidas a este espacio.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to thank you for being here today. You're all most welcome to this space.
En este contexto donde se están transnacionalizando las formas de violencia contra los cuerpos, sexualidades y géneros que
We
se
can
salen de
see
las normas,
that within this time, we see that violence against genders is really going beyond the borders. So it's becoming a trans-border crime against human beings.
creemos necesaria un diálogo transcontinental a través del cual podamos reflexionar sobre las formas en las cuales se expresan estas violencias en diferentes contextos del globo.
So against that background, we feel that we need to have a transcontinental dialogue so we can all discuss and make more visible all these different forms of abuse, discrimination, and violence against different people.
A veces pareciera que estas violencias son naturales cuando las vemos solo desde el presente y consideramos que la reflexión desde una perspectiva histórica o ese diálogo entre el pasado y el presente permite ver la formación de estas formas y también pensar en su fin.
It would seem that these violent forms are only natural, but they are not. You have to go back in history and understand that there is a whole historical background to all this violence that has been exerted against diverse people.
Así que proponemos para este espacio como 4 grandes temas de reflexión. El primero tiene que ver con esas formas transnacionales en las que se expresan la relación entre colonialidad y sexualidad y las formas en que se transnacionaliza esas formas de violencia hacia cuerpos, géneros y sexualidades que, digamos, atentan contra esos órdenes heteronormativos.
So we are going to pose or share with you basically 4 reflections that will explain or dwell on the different forms of coloniality, sexuality, and how these forms of violence have gone beyond borders and have transcended them and have gone against different genders.
El segundo tiene que ver entonces con esas formas en las cuales se expresan esos lugares hegemónicos del poder, lugares como la religión, como los estados, son entonces como las formas de administración de justicia y de criminalización, son ese segundo campo sobre el cual nos interesa reflexionar.
Then the second area where we would like to reflect would be this focus on the centers of hegemonic power that are very much based on religion, state, the justice system, and the criminalization of many of these cases. And I propose that we should reflect on this other field.
Sin embargo, afortunadamente, tenemos una capacidad de agencia. Afortunadamente, esas formas hegemónicas no logran desaparecer los deseos, las expresiones, la agencia y la existencia misma de sujetos que de alguna u otra forma atentan contra esos órdenes heteronormativos.
And of course, this is a very important capability we should discuss in how we will be able to confront and counter these hegemonic powers because they suppress the desires and the very existence of these subjects who have an alterity.
Por eso queremos insistir en ese carácter móvil de esas estructuras. Queremos insistir en la posibilidad de fisurarlas y en la posibilidad de ensanchar los márgenes liminales en los cuales los órdenes hegemónicos han creado.
And of course, we need to emphasize that we need to do a greater effort to try to stretch all these different margins that will cause these forms of violence to be used against us, and also we need to try to pierce holes on those systems and try to crack it so we can really get to the bottom of it.
Por eso finalmente nos interesa pensar en las maneras en las que estas reflexiones sobre diferentes contextos coloniales, estas reflexiones también históricas, nos permitan crear proyectos futuros desde el presente.
So we really need to think about how these colonial context and this historical background will inform all the reflections that we are going to discuss during this event, and will make us all more aware and more conscious about the need to understand and counter these forms with these ideas.
Ok, entonces invitamos a Carlos de nuevo.
So we should like to invite Carlos again
Thank
to
you.
speak to you.
Thank you, Pablo. Thank you. So we're going to have two sessions, one in the morning and one in the afternoon. The first one will be two presentations, one by Joseph Massad and the second one by Anjali Arondekar. Is that the right way to pronounce your name? Arondekar. And I will also contribute a short presentation to this conversation, which will be followed by a conversation amongst the three of us, moderated by Pablo. Joseph Massad will begin, who is a professor of modern Arab politics and intellectual history at Columbia University in New York. He is the author of Colonial Effects, The Making of National Identity in Jordan, The Persistence of the Palestinian Question, Desiring Arabs, which also received the Lionel Trilling Book Award, and Islam and Liberalism. His research is widely published in academic journals, and his columns have appeared in Al Jazeera English website, Electronic Intifada, Al Aram Weekly, Counterpunch, the London Guardian, the Lebanese-based Akhbar, and the Cairo-based Al Shuruk. Thank you, Joseph, for joining us.
Thank you, Carlos, very much for inviting me. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, and thanks to Maria Elena for including me in this important project of yours, and I hope we can have some lively discussions today about the implications of both the artwork and the intellectual engagement with these similar themes. My paper will speak about sort of a confluence between Islamophobia and homophobia more generally, but with some concentration on colonial relations with the Arab world and the Islamic world and the Orient more generally. Everyone was confused. Was Omar Mateen an Islamofascist homophobe or a disgruntled and confused young Muslim gay man who wanted revenge? The analysis following Mateen's attack on a gay bar in Orlando in June 2016 ranged from the Islamophobic to the homophobic. It seemed to many that either Muslims or gays were responsible for homophobia, or, as it appeared to others, that closetedness leads to Islamofascism, which begets homophobia, especially if the alleged closeted man was a Muslim. The latter view is derived from the popular wisdom that most homophobic men are repressed homosexuals, which leads to the conclusion that homophobia is something adopted and practiced by repressed homosexuals against liberated homosexuals. Where do these ideas come from? How have sexuality and Islam gotten to be so intertwined in a Western Christian and liberal setting, to the point that Westerners can no longer speak of one without conjuring up the specter of the other? Let me begin with 19th century Europe, which is the time and site for the European production of something called sexuality, another called the Orient, and another called Islam, and yet one more called the Arab world. Europe itself was invented during the Renaissance and elaborated during the Enlightenment, even if it remains an amorphous entity geographically and demographically, let alone culturally. The production of colonial European knowledge about the Orient, Islam, and the Arab world was from the outset knowledge that was counterposed to how European colonial liberalism depicted Europe. If liberal Europe saw itself as a democracy, Islam and the Arabs were said to live under Oriental despotism. If liberal Europe treated its women as free human beings, Muslims and Arabs treated them, we are told, as slaves. These two ideas would continue to guide European and American liberal representations of Europe, and especially white America, and the Orient and Islam until the present. There was a third component, however, that would undergo important changes, namely the sexual desires and practices of Europe versus those of Islam and the Arab world. Under the new capacious umbrella of sexuality, a secularized European medicine and law transformed European Christianity's concern with sin to a concern about pathology and criminality in order to establish modern secular European behavioral norms, indeed to set the conditions for European colonial subjectivity and normativity. As Anne Laura Stoller's crucial corrective to Michel Foucault has demonstrated, sexuality was born of the colonial encounter, and the European concern about racial miscegenation, as well as a sexual desire as sites of contestation of the European colonial order. Whereas the earlier moment of the European conquest of the Americas witnessed with horror the sinful sexual practices of Native Americans, who, of course, were considered Orientals or Indians upon being encountered by European conquerors, which would feed Europe's genocidal policies against them, the secularized 19th century obsessed over the future of the European colonial bourgeoisie itself and its progeny, which was being prepared to inherit the earth. It is amidst these ongoing colonial concerns that the hetero-homo binary was born in mid-century. If people had differing kinds of sexual desires and engaged in various sexual acts before, once sexuality was invented, people were transformed into subjects of it, sexual subjects, subjects endowed with sexuality. Sexual subjectivity essentializes the subject's desires and sexual practices as inherent to the subject, indeed as the subject's very identity, biologically, existentially, and socially, or more precisely, medically and juridically. It is at the moment of the confluence of modern state technologies of managing populations, which Michel Foucault calls governmentality, that the homosexual is invented in Europe, soon to be followed by the heterosexual. In the new age of statistical norms, one was abnormal, deviant, primitive, sick, and decadent. The other was normal, modern, and healthy. But the heterosexual also was bifurcated between the normal and the normative on the one hand, and the deviant and the sick on the other. These were not only categories used to designate European colonial subjects, but also whole civilizations that Europe was conquering and sought to conquer. Here, Orientalism prepared the way in depicting Orientals, Muslims, and Arabs as profligate, decadent, and deviant. The Prophet of Islam, Muhammad, himself, was said to have had a voracious sexual appetite, and that he was a child molester to boot. His marriage to the young Aisha was the ready proof of these European contentions. Never mind that Europeans married their daughters at the same age as Aisha or younger for the next millennium after the Prophet. But that was not all. As Europe was beset with Victorian sexual and social norms corresponding to the new discourses of law and medicine, Muslims and Arabs, not to mention all Orientals and Africans, were said to be historically and at present uninhibited sexually, committing sexual abominations, including, but not exclusive to, polygamy, polygyny, polyandry, homosexuality, bestiality, and sex with minors, which the European liberal sensibility could not tolerate. European scholarship and knowledge insisted that the Arabs and Muslims throughout their history, and as a reflection of their religion, were sexual extremists, unlike liberal Europeans whose sexual desires and practices were governed by modern civilized moderation. Psychoanalysis would contest the new essentialisms of sexology and biology, even if it partook of, or indeed depended on, their anthropological fascination and horror with the sexual practices of non-Europeans. Later trends within psychoanalysis, especially American ego psychology, would end up, however, endorsing these essentialisms. By the 1950s, as the new sexual categories had become institutionalized and the new homo-hetero binary was established as an essential biological norm for sexual subjectivity, studies of the modern Arab world would speak with horror and disgust about Arab men's polymorphous sexual desires and practices. Here a boy, there a man, a woman, 2 or 3 women. Arab and Muslim women's uninhibited sexual appetites would also inform the travelogues of 19th and early 20th century European male travelers fascinated with the harem and what unfolded behind its walls, people like Flaubert, Edward Lane, and others. A new sexual tourism was born, but not only for European men identified now as heterosexual, who sought the pleasures of Arab and Muslim women, people like Pierre Loti, for example, but the depiction of the Arab world as a decadent sexual environment also fascinated the recently emergent white homosexual men from Europe and the United States, some of whom would go on sexual tours of the region and even settle there, even writers like Paul Bowles, Joe Orton, Jean Genet, William S. Burroughs, Roland Barthes, et al. This would predominate as a new discourse on sexual rights emerged in the 1960s to counter a century of European sexual pathologization. In order to defend themselves against the charge of pathology, the new sexual libertarians, including white homosexual anthropologists, endorsed the essentialist universalization of sexuality, if not of sexual subjectivity, by pointing out that their desires and practices were widespread around the globe and that they were not alone in exhibiting them. As the rise of sexual rights discourse became more successful by the late 1970s and early 1980s, it would quickly become integrated in Western foreign policy and media propaganda against the liberal West's major political enemy, namely communism. Whereas the communist movement had supported an earlier instance of sexual rights that emerged in the early 1920s and was exemplified by the Soviet decriminalization of homosexuality throughout the 1920s and early 1930s, Stalin would recriminalize homosexuality in 1934, joining the liberal West's horror at sexual decadence. Romania and later Cuba would be 2 other communist states that followed the Stalinist example. East Germany, of course, under communist rule, never criminalized homosexuality, unlike its West German neighbor, not to mention liberal Britain, where homosexuality remained illegal till the late 1960s. Just as the initial success of the white middle-class US feminism in the 1970s began to be reversed in the 1980s, leading white American feminists to shift their interest from a domestic agenda to save third world women from non-European sexisms internationally, especially from Muslim patriarchy, from Muslim patriarchy and Arab patriarchy. The sexual rights movement similarly would throw its lot with the 1980s anti-communist campaign targeting Cuba with a film titled Improper Conduct about the hardship of Cuban homosexuals. Produced in France by Cuban émigrés, the film won several human rights prizes in Western Europe, in addition to the Best Documentary Audience Award at the 1984 San Francisco International Lesbian and Gay Film Festival. The film, of course, sought to be an indictment of the Cuban Revolution and of communism more generally. If the US government in the late 1940s, bolstered by McCarthyism in the 1950s, targeted homosexuals as potential communist spies for the Soviets and purged them from government service, the leadership of the white gay movement would join the right-wing Reaganite crusade against communism and the Soviets in the 1980s to prove its patriotism and link the gay agenda to American imperialism. This is an important moment in the birth of what would become the twin US and European foreign policy on women's and sexual rights that reached new heights after the US invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq at the dawn of the 21st century. That Cuba was both a third world country and a communist country was the perfect entry point for the attack. Suddenly, the US, which had laws criminalizing sodomy in half of its states, began to champion itself and be championed by American gays as a heaven and a haven of sexual rights that must be internationalized and universalized to encompass the entire globe. This is also the moment when Arabs and Muslims are transformed from degenerate, profligate, uninhibited sexual beings compared to Victorian Europeans into a repressed and repressive lot that discriminates against women and oppresses homosexuals, unlike the new liberated white Americans and Europeans. In the meanwhile, American gay tourists, many of whom are now identified as human rights activists or workers, and in the employ of powerful human rights organizations whose power derived from having served as Western instruments in the Cold War against the Soviets, began to write about the marvel that is the Arab world, Islam, and Africa, where it is said homosexuality predominates, but homosexuals do not. The new human rights discourse was horrified to learn that homosexual and heterosexual practices considered unacceptable in the West were practiced in these regions of the world, while others that had recently become acceptable in the West were not. Most horrifying of all, however, was the realization that men and women who practice different sex coitus or same-sex coitus do not identify as heterosexual and homosexual in these regions. It is thus that the hetero-homo binary became the new dyad of the sexual in discussions of civilizational, cultural, and religious worth during European high colonialism and in current US imperial rhetorics. This applies as much to European colonial and American imperial anthropologists, officials, and activists, and to colonized Arab, Muslim, and African elites, including intellectuals and activists. These latter elites had been shamed by the West's late 19th century designation of their societies as sexually permissive and profligate and therefore primitive, when they needed to be repressive like Victorian Europe to be modern. In response, these elites sought since the beginning of the 20th century to identify their modern cultures with European sexual normativity, only for the tables to be turned on them in the 1980s as they start to be shamed by Europeans and Americans yet again, this time for not being sexually permissive enough, and for not being liberal sexually, and for being repressive. As part of the American gay movement joined the right-wing direction of US politics in the 1980s, with some major internal schisms at first on account of the homophobic response to AIDS in the US, most of them would follow suit in the 1990s, and as such came to adopt the biological and legal essentialisms of the 19th century and insisted they must be universalized. In doing so, through the US government and its arm twisting at the United Nations, countries which had never legislated laws against sexual practices, or if they had such colonial laws on the books had not activated them, began to persecute a new category of being that the Western sexual missionaries insisted on identifying as homosexual or gay. This is how Muslims and Africans have become today the main target of the sexual rights missionaries and European and US condemnation for not adhering to the hetero-homo binary. In the 1920s, as the Soviet authorities decriminalized homosexuality in the European parts of the Soviet Union, they insisted on criminalizing homosexual practices between men and boys in the Oriental and Muslim parts of the country. The US would replicate this practice in Afghanistan a century later, where Americans are told with horror about the persistence of man-boy sexual relations in Afghanistan, which coexists apparently with the repression of Western-style homosexuality. The American government, it would seem, and with them a right-wing gay movement dominated by white gay men, seek to criminalize one form of homosexuality and decriminalize another. In the process, much of this missionizing has resulted in the production of men, especially men, who are identified as gay by these American missionaries, and increasingly by their own governments and state apparatuses. In identifying practitioners of forms of sex that the West has designated as reflective of subjective and hence juridical identities, a number of Arab, Muslim, and African states began to issue laws or activate dormant ones to persecute the recently identified men. The more the Western missionaries pushed to identify their new objects of rescue, the more repression ensued. But that is not all. The impact would go beyond criminalization and the juridical to refashion the psychological. As same-sex relations began to be pushed by the West as reflective of subjective identities, most men and women in Arab and Muslim and African contexts who had previously engaged in them began to fear being identified as non-normative and abandoned the practice, thus becoming heterosexualized in the process. While this only occurred among the upper classes and the upper middle classes, the American sexual missionaries were not satisfied, as they want all classes in society to be transformed into subjects of the hetero-homo binary. This is where gay internationalism operates today, through international NGOs with local chapters, through activism at the United Nations, and through imperial hubris in foreign relations. In the case of Egypt, the white gay missionaries have instigated a public outcry and massive governmental repression against Egyptian men identified as homosexuals, where no such repression had ever existed prior to their intervention or their internationalization of Western sexual subjectivities. The US governmental adoption of gay internationalism has become so institutionalized and so focused on what it terms the Islamic world that the US Embassy in Islamabad and its ambassador Richard Hoagland and members of gays and lesbians in foreign affairs agencies hosted the US Embassy's, quote, first ever gay, lesbian, bisexual, and transgender pride celebration on the 26th of June 2011. The announcement by the Obama White House in December 2011 that the US government will link its foreign aid program to the adherence of other countries to its vision of sexual rights and the protection of sexual identities, which was also articulated in a speech by then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, is one of the most recent and grandiose of these imperial policy gestures. It should be mentioned, of course, that Obama was actually following British Prime Minister David Cameron, who threatened suspension of aid to Nigeria in October 2011 over the issue of gay rights. But this is not all. As US fundamentalist Christians continue to missionize an earlier project of heterosexualizing the heathens, they have entered into a protracted war with US gay internationalists over the bodies of Africans. A draconian law imposing the death penalty on homosexual activity proposed in Uganda in 2009 as threatening the African family was instigated by American evangelicals proselytizing in the country. It was left to the Gay International to launch a campaign against the anti-homosexuality bill of 2009. Even the New York Times, usually known for its gay internationalism, had to admit that, quote, Uganda seems to have become a far-flung front line in the American culture wars, with American groups on both sides, the Christian right and gay activists pouring in support and money as they get involved in the broader debate over homosexuality in Africa, unquote. The bill was passed in December 2013 in Parliament, but Ugandan President Museveni refused to sign it, declaring that it was passed illegally and that homosexuals were abnormal but needed to be rescued. The case of South Africa is most telling, especially in its marketing by white American and European gay internationalists as a weapon to shame non-white countries that refuse to follow its example, and as evidence that a commitment to sexual citizenship and gayness is not an exclusive Euro-American and West European affair. But the deal concluded between white South African gays and lesbians and gay internationalists on the one hand and the African National Congress on the other to produce the equality clause in the post-apartheid South African Constitution demonstrates precisely how this imperial white racialized project came to be. The involvement of the International Lesbian and Gay Association, ILGA, and the exclusively white Gay Association of South Africa, GASA, since the early 1980s, and the subsequent transformations which led to the self-disbanding of GASA in 1987 and its re-emergence in other organizational forms, have been well documented, as has the blackmail to which GASA was subject by some elements in ILGA to couple its struggle for white gay rights with the anti-apartheid struggle, and the blackmail to which the African National Congress was subjected by current and former GASA members in the process, in the form of, we will support your struggle if you support ours. 2 decades after the success of that blackmail, American gay scholars are still complaining that gayness in South Africa as identity and as a protected form of sexual citizenship remains mostly within the purview of whiteness, while the majority of black South Africans have not internalized it, and in those cases where they did, cannot access the legal protections provided for them by the law. None of this is important for the Euro-American missionaries, however, as their faith in the liberatory potential of sexual identities is so strong that if anyone questions it, he or she will be immediately cast as a heretical non-believer who seeks to repress sexual pleasure. Indeed, Islam and Africa seem to be the only two heretical pillars left standing against the onslaught of this Western sexual mission. Right-wing Europeans and Americans, who until recently hated homosexuals and expressed much homophobia, have joined gay internationalism and the public defense of homosexuality as a pretext for Islamophobia, as has happened in Holland, France, Germany, and Sweden, among other places, where the extreme right-wing politicians now have basically transformed themselves from homophobes into Islamophobes and pro-homosexual rights. Last week, these right-wingers have been joined by a straight fundamentalist white American named Joseph Schreiber, a 32-year-old member of the sect Jews for Jesus, who was charged with arson for burning down the mosque where Omar Mateen had occasionally worshipped. Schreiber is a right-wing American Islamophobe and a militant supporter of the right-wing Israeli government of Benjamin Netanyahu and of Republican candidate Donald Trump, not usually a candidate that supports gay rights in the US context. The previous deadliest attack on a gay bar before Orlando was at the Upstairs Lounge in June 1973 in New Orleans, which was set on fire. 32 people were killed. The official cause is still listed as undetermined origin. The most likely suspect, a gay Latino man named Roger Nunez, a US Army veteran who had been thrown out of the bar earlier in the day, was never charged. He committed suicide the following year. No one burnt down the church where Nunez had worshipped, nor targeted Latinos as culprits for his crime, as has been the case more recently with Muslim Americans. But the times are different. Nunez, the alleged arsonist, who was a hustler, committed his crime in 1973 at a time when gayness in the US was a pathology medically and was illegal, of course, in New Orleans for 40 years after that, until 2003, or 30 years after. Today, we live in a world where not Western homosexuality, but Islam and its sexual desires and practices and its very culture have become pathologized, and if some politicians have their way, fully criminalized. It is this that distinguishes the reactions to Nunez from the reactions to Mateen. In the case of Nunez, his alleged crime was individual. In the case of Mateen's, it is cultural, religious, and national, in addition to being individual. Mateen, who was born in the US to Afghan immigrant parents, would truly have grown up with a different notion of sexual desire had his family remained in Afghanistan than the one he grew up with in the US, in New York specifically. As far as all existing evidence shows, Mateen did not make any homophobic statements when he spoke with the police and the 911 operator as he was committing his horrific massacre. The police, as far as we are told, have not found any homophobic posts on his Facebook page. His crime, therefore, complicates further the way Islamophobia and homophobia interact in a liberal American imperial setting. The stories circulating about the sexual history of Mateen, whether they're true or not is irrelevant, have made him a victim of both homophobia and Islamophobia simultaneously, which many of the same people who believe his motives lay in his Muslim identity, also believing that they lay in his alleged gay identity. While the victims of Mateen's horrific violence, who are mostly gay Latinos of color, have been adopted by a white American liberal culture that claims no longer to pathologize them or to criminalize them, this only became possible by the white American liberal culture's ability to culturalize and sexualize Mateen's crime as the condition for its no tolerance. In our neoliberal imperial age, it seems believing in democracy, women's rights, and sexual rights might very well lead one to anti-Islamic attitudes. It seems then not the case that Islamofascism leads to homophobia, as we have been told, but rather that homophilia, or love of Western-style homosexuals, in part is what begets Islamophobia. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joseph. Maria Elena has just told me to inform you that the symposium is being live streamed on the Facebook page of the museum, in case you want to text that to some friends or whatever. Thank you, Joseph. I now want to call Anjali Arondekar to the stage. Anjali is Associate Professor of Feminist Studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is the author of For the Record, on Sexuality and the Colonial Archive in India, that was the winner of the Alan Bray Memorial Book Award for Best Book in Lesbian, Gay, or Queer Studies, Modern Language Association in 2010. Her current book project, Abundance on Sexuality and Historiography, grows out of her interest in the figurations of sexuality, ethics, and collectivity in colonial British and Portuguese India. Thank you, Anjali, for joining us. Do you have a presentation?
Joseph is a hard act to follow, but I'm going to do my best. Thank you to Maria Elena and Carlos for thinking of me in what I hope will be a good and robust conversation. I sort of took Carlos's project and exhibition as the animating question to think about how we write about histories of sexuality in relationship to the archives we construct around them. So without further ado. Marginality and loss, paucity and disenfranchisement, these are the terms that have become the common currency of histories of sexuality. The missing amphora of sexuality is recovered from the archival detritus of hegemonic histories of colonialism and nationalism and showcased within more liberatory narratives of reforms and rights. I think Joseph has already talked about that. This orientation to loss, things that are lost, missing, mutatis mutandis, surfaces very strongly within sexuality studies in the Euro-American Academy, where the current recuperation of concepts such as queer negativity, queer failure, cruel optimism have equally and ironically preserved the linking of histories of sexuality to forms of loss and failure in the face of, or rather because of our embattled political horizons. Now, tropes of loss, I want to suggest, especially abound in queer historiographical work, where sexualities falsely pathologized pasts and archives are recuperated and reinstated as sources of sanctuary, jouissance, rather than despair. This is obviously one of the impulses behind Carlos's work as well, and I wanted to think with him around that question. So sexuality thus endures as an object of historical recovery, it seems, through a poetics of melancholia, an irresolvable longing for loss that refuses all forms of consolation. To be clear here, I'm not facilely lambasting or rejecting such histories of sexuality. Rather, my meditations today call upon a historiography that pushes against the binding energies of such melancholic historicism. After all, in the face of the casual brutality of dispersed suffering in the global south or in South Asia where I work, there is, as many scholars have written, nothing spectacular to report about loss anymore. Indeed, privileging of loss, past or present, assumes an eventfulness that flounders in the face of the ordinary, chronic, and cruddy syncopations of everyday subaltern life. To fix sexuality primarily within such an arsenal of archival loss, while politically exigent, is to refuse alternative histories of emergence. I want to ruminate today on more imaginative histories of sexuality, full of intrepid archives and acts of invention, full of pith and moment. At its most ambitious, my talk will pose two very broad and vulgar questions. What happens if we abandon the historical language of search and rescue and focus instead on sexuality as a site of radical abundance, even futurity? What would it mean to let go of our attachments to loss, to unmoor ourselves, as it were, from the absence of reliable coasts? Now, in my previous book, I had grappled with these thorny questions about writing about a pressing impasse in our recuperation of the historical archive, about the demands placed on histories of sexuality, particularly such as those in South Asia that entangle with questions of colonialism and race, and about the multiple double binds that emerge from it. I had argued that the promise of archival presence, finding an object, as future knowledge is always circulated in relation to historical desire, a desire for lost bodies, subjects, and texts, and for the evidentiary models they enable. My efforts now in this current project, however, are more drawn to grappling with how such forms of recovery, recuperation of archives assume their more salutary forms of loss precisely in the service of collectivities, tallying up what they do not as yet have. Now, far from repudiating such salvific forms, instantiated as they routinely are in the language of lost rights and representation, I would like to ask two questions. One, how do subaltern minority collectivities wrestle with the evidentiary forms that such archival models of loss demand? In other words, what does an archive need to look like before it is taken seriously as an archive worthy of retrieval? Number two, how do collectivities assemble historical archives that self-consciously activate the compensatory mechanisms that such narratives of loss should or will produce? Now, such concerns have become especially pressing for me through my research on the emergence of a Devadasi diaspora, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj. Devadasi is a compound Sanskrit term coupling Deva, or God, with Dasi, or female slave, a pan-Indian term falsely interchangeable with courtesan, dancing girl, prostitute, homosexual, and sex worker. Members of this diaspora, also referred to as Kalavans, literally carriers of kala or art, shuttled between Portuguese and British colonial India for over 200 years, challenging European epistemologies of race and rule through their inhabitation in two discrepant empires. Tracing its roots back to early 18th century Goa, which is the flagship of Portuguese India, the Gomantak Maratha Samaj. Gomantak means from Goa. Maratha is a pan-caste term referring to people of a particular caste. Samaj means collectivity. Is an other backward caste community, meaning a Dalit and lower caste community in South Asia, and was established as a formal organization in 1927 and 29 in the western states of Goa and Maharashtra, respectively. It officially became a charitable institution in 1936. Now, this Samaj, this collectivity, continues its activities to this day and has from its inception maintained a community of 50,000 to 100,000 registered members. Unlike more received histories of sexuality in South Asia and beyond, the history of this community offers no telos of loss and recovery. Instead, the Samaj, from its inception, has maintained a copious, continuous, and accessible archive of its own emergence, embracing rather than disavowing its past and present attachments to sexuality. Now, this collectivity's archive, housed in Goa and in Mumbai, constitute an efflorescence of information in three primary languages, Marathi, Konkani, and Portuguese, ranging from minutes of meetings, journals, newsletters, private correspondences, flyers, programs, all filled with details of the daily exigencies and crises that concerned the community. Now, such efflorescence appears startling, almost jarring, pushing against our archival expectations of absence and erasure. The Samaj archives are housed in open collections and have always been available for public viewing since their formation in 1929. Any one of you could walk in and look at these materials. In fact, this Samaj's incitement to archive is only surpassed by its startling disinterest in the preservation and circulation of the very materials it continually produces. A researcher's or even a curious visitor's request for rare materials is met with relative ease, a feat for anyone who's ever worked in archives, as one is directed to the archives without fanfare and often with a cup of hot chai to accompany one's reading, another blasphemy within the archives. Now, when asked about the potential loss of valuable historical materials, I'll tell you the story in a more vernacular way. So when I started doing this research, I was looking at 18th, 19th century pamphlets that were literally falling apart in my hands. So as a well-trained historiographical subject, I went back the next day in Goa with Ziploc bags because I wanted to put those things in there so they wouldn't fall apart. So as I was doing this, one of the archivists said to me, "What are you doing, madam?" And I said, "Well, I'm, trying to preserve these materials." And she turned to me and said, "That is a hasaishi ghoshta, a laughable matter." Because for these archivists and these scholars, the risk of loss is a laughable matter, where the preservation of rare materials is of little consequence. After all, as she reminded me, theirs was an oversaturated archive, so full at it seems that it struggled to manage the daily challenges of housing the new documents that continue to be produced. Now, I've been reading these materials for over 10 years, and I've only read 40% of them. So you can imagine how massive this archive is. Now, in contrast to the imperative that we are all used to as curators, scholars, artists, to immure and preserve archival materials, the Samaj archives appear instead to be focused on the sustenance of an archive whose abundant productions negotiate a very different sightline to futurity. Here, the return to history of sexuality is not through a call to loss of object or of materials, but rather through ordinary surplus. To this day, new materials continue to enter the Samaj archives, with little effort being expended to either digitalize or republish older or more fragile materials. And this is not because of lack of resources. This community is quite well endowed, but they are simply not interested in digitalizing or saving their materials. Now, in obvious ways, the presence of this vibrant Devadasi diaspora in Western India, spliced as it is between British and Portuguese India. India was liberated from the British in 1947. Goa was liberated from the Portuguese in 1961. So very late. The Portuguese were in India for over 450 years. So it is one of the longest, most enduring empires, right? In terms of thinking about these comparative modes, regional South-South, which would certainly enrich our understanding of sexuality's past, we have to be attentive that we do not turn to this story of the Samaj as a singular parable of cathartic potentiality, resolving historical ambivalence or loss through its success and emergence. Rather, I want to suggest today with an example, the archives of this collectivity must be read as exemplars of catachresis, as places of analytical reflection that produce more robust idioms of the historical. Now, let me turn, more interestingly, to one such example within those archives. That thrilling dark night. Bandachi ti romanchakari ek ratra, a thrilling dark night of insurrection, 25th May 1921. It is 10 p.m. and we are under attack. Our house has been surrounded on all four sides and I can hear loud cries and whistles as stones and rocks pummel our doors. I run to the courtyard to see all the women and children huddled together in fear. As the attack escalates, the children begin to lose control and defecate on themselves in fear. The women scream till their throats run dry, only to realize that there's no water left in the house. My wife, who is very ill, unable to bear the stress, falls to the ground in shock. I run to the rooftop with my gun in hand and shoot aimlessly into the darkness of the night, unsure if I am killing or will be killed. I scream out into the night, and suddenly the attackers retreat and an eerie calm returns. Thus writes, and this is my translated summary from the Portuguese of a 12-page description, Raja Ram Rangoji Paingankar, the son of a Devadasi. If you remember, Devadasi is a term for prostitute, courtesan, sex worker, occasionally homosexual sodomite. Literally a term used also for people with kala, an art. Thus writes Paingarkar in the first volume of his much heralded autobiography, Me Kon, Who Am I? The attack takes place in Paingirn, a small village in the taluka of Kankona, southern Goa, a key stronghold of the Goan Devadasi community. Once morning break, Paingarkar recounts the events to the village headman, who accompanies him back home to inspect and corroborate the damage done to his household. In due course, Paingarkar and his extended family of 25 women and children abandon their home and seek their shelter in a neighboring village. Now, there is, as is expected in any narrative retelling, a prehistory to the attack. 4 days earlier, on 21st May 1921, Paingarkar and his comrades hold a general Satyanarayan Puja, a religious ritual that celebrates Lord Vishnu and is often held to commemorate an auspicious occasion, calling for a refusal of caste hierarchies. An enthusiastic crowd of over 1,000 people from 5 neighboring villages gathered, composed primarily of the lowest subgroupings of the Devadasi community, a smattering of curious Portuguese officials, and a few breakaway Saraswat Brahmins. The Brahmins are, of course, the highest in the caste hierarchy, and they're also the patrons of these Devadasis. They are largely the people who these Devadasis service in terms of their sexual activities. Enraged by the repeated caste humiliation and sexual exploitation suffered by the Devadasis at the hands of the Brahmins, Paingarkar demands an end to Brahmin hegemony. Yet despite all the excitement, the puja, the religious ritual, remains unfinished. No priest is willing to step forward to complete the rites, fearing the wrath of the Brahmins. And the wrath of the Brahmins does follow. Paingarkar and the larger Devadasi community in Goa are immediately banned from all social functions, their lands confiscated, and a general sanction is imposed. Even worse, hundreds of Brahmin youth are rumored to have taken up arms in retaliation and threatened to attack and destroy the Devadasi community. There are signs that anti-Brahmin activity is also spreading simultaneously in southern Goa, as similar religious rituals are said to be taking place. Now, the scene is thus set for the inevitable events of that thrilling dark night. After the attack, another extraordinary set of events takes place. Paingarkar, along with 25 Devadasis, travel to Panjim, acquire legal representation, and submit a writ appeal to the Governor General of Portuguese Goa, Jaime Alberto de Castro Moraes. In the appeal, Paingarkar calls for a repatriation of the rights of the Devadasis. Now remember, if you are familiar with the Portuguese Empire, the period between 1920 and 1925 in Portuguese India is seen as a period of republicanism. It's before Salazar, who becomes the evil sort of leader of the Portuguese Empire, arrives, and it is a period when liberalism is starting to found its roots within the question of empire. So this is a period when there is relatively modest but significant progress in terms of questions of reform and rights. So this is a moment when Paingarkar goes to the governor and says, look, you need to do something about this. We are being exploited, our lands are being taken away. Now, it is therefore less of a surprise, given that this period is very important, that Governor Moraes responds positively to the submitted appeal. So moved is Moraes by the plight of these distraught Devadasis that he immediately censures the Brahmin and orders official protection for the Devadasis. News of the appeal spreads and editorials appear everywhere, and this is seen as, for a lot of historians, as the beginnings of a grassroots movement against Brahmin hegemony. Now, just as his readers and you are ready to settle into this rousing account of brave resistance, Paingarkar reveals an even more thrilling twist to his tale. In the opening gambit of the second volume of his autobiography, remember the event is from the first volume, which is entitled, the opening gambit, the second volume is entitled, Me Gharavar Halla Ka Ghadvun Anla. Why did I stage the attack on my house? Recall that the above-mentioned account, again, appears in the first volume. Paingarkar explains that the attack was, in fact, ek Saubhadra Natak, a strategic drama, directed precisely to protect and advance the interests of Devadasis. His words underscore the constant humiliation experienced by Devadasis, a humiliation that precipitates the ritual of the puja. Paingarkar, for example, recounts his degrading experiences at the residence of a local Brahmin, where he is invited for a meal, only then to be asked to partake of the food in a soiled plate used to feed animals in the house. It is at this point in the drama, we are told, that Paingarkar, at the behest of his best friend and lover, the Devadasi Bhima, and in complete secrecy, persuades 6 comrades to attack his home on that fateful night. The comrades are given detailed instructions about when they should attack, from which vantage point, and for how long. Each individual is asked to recite prepared lines explaining their whereabouts at a neighbor's residence, should any of them be questioned. Not a soul is told of the carefully orchestrated attack, except those directly involved, and even Paingarkar's family members remain in the dark. Remember, his own wife passes out in fear. Now, such secrecy, writes Paingarkar, guarantees the narrative heft of the attack as the heinous work of frenzied Brahmin youth. Bhima, the Devadasi who serves as the director behind the scenes, sets the stage perfectly for the fateful night of insurrection. Mobilizing established economies of rumor, fear, and humiliation, Bhima, along with her sister Devadasis, ensures that the larger community embraces and indeed anticipates the fiction of the attack. Guns are mysteriously set off around Devadasi homes previous to the night of the attack, and a general fear of Brahmin retaliation suffuses. An attack on Paingarkar's home thus provides the necessary climax to such calculated and frenzied fear, so perfectly scripted are the conditions of his production. And the staging, as we already know, does produce its desired effects. In addition to the alleged case against the Brahmins, a school is also established for the Devadasi community that exists to this day. Now, does the revelation that the attack was so deftly staged as an archival event denude it of salvific value, or does its narrative veracity, but in fact an event was being staged, inaugurate a different understanding of archival production? Let me explain what I mean. For anyone here who has worked within historical archives, it would come as no surprise that any hegemonic text making confident claims to historical truth will be destabilized and exceeded by the operation of counter-archives, counter-stories that disrupt any and all ideological project being advanced. Such a critical understanding, however, does not, I want to suggest quite counterintuitively, extend to minoritized archives, where the subversion resistance hypothesis, despite or perhaps because of the contaminations of Foucault, Michel Foucault, and the Subaltern Studies group, continues to function as difference's most consequential and enticing effect, even as the most rigorous intentions to the contrary have not prevented the preservation of a veracity archive that promises, even as the activity of its own demystification are rehearsed. We're still looking for verifiable archives, even as we understand those archives to be compromised. For someone like myself, who's currently writing a book on these Goan Devadasis, this staged event provides an alternate model that refuses the stability of a spectacle, of an archival trace, to hold or destroy, and focuses instead on the forms archives are asked to assume. In the case of this particular event, Paingarkar, the author, exhibits a keen understanding of such archival expectations as he situates his representational tactics within a long, routinized and political demands for such archival events. If you have read the work of historians who write about subaltern studies, each one of them will talk about the importance of an event like this attack that inaugurates a movement, right? Even if that event is overdetermined, there is a need for that event. So part of what I'm trying to say is that the architecture of this attack reprises these sets of representations that are so central to any subaltern history of opposition or resistance. Within the lineaments of the story, Paingankar accesses earlier stylized repertoires of representation. These repertoires disinvest from the plots of social realism's truth-telling, instead inviting us to reenact the archival event through the craft and craftiness of survival. This is the kala, the art, the aesthetic of the archive. Just to conclude, a couple more paragraphs. Now, in so doing, Paingankar subjects the veracity archive to a crucial modification. He produces repeated evidence of the staging of the attack in the second volume, such that we are, as readers, asked to retool our foundational understanding around historical recuperation. We are asked to negotiate the modalities of archival recognition, to document, as it were, the staging of an event. The ethical burden shifts away from the literal translation of the historical attack or the historical record to thinking more of its literariness, its kala in making a history possible. Now, at this point, one may well ask, how does an archival story of a staged attack in a remote part of southern Goa provide both the mass and patina for a non-melancholic historiography of sexuality? Those readers and listeners wishing to find queerness in this talk through the materiality of lost subjects aspiring to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or transgender, or even through archives that might somehow fold back into an identity form, will find few treasures here. Rather, these archives, I want to suggest, offer a challenge to the lineages through which reproductive futurities constitute their authority. Here, the return to a history of sexuality is not through a call to loss of object and/or materials, but rather through radical abundance, through an archive that is incommensurable and quotidien, imaginative and ordinary. Far from coupling archival accumulation with straightforward historical availability, the Samaj's story challenges and indeed undermines the very idea of an archive. Bypassing the demands for recuperation, reproduction, revision, reparation, these are the terms you're very familiar with, these archives stubbornly enact, I want to suggest, queer readings that unsettle the foundational link between historical reproduction and archival preservation, which is the center of some of the conversations we're going to have. Radical abundance here is presence without return or the fear of loss. Remember my conversation with the curator who said, "What are you doing? Why do you want to save these materials?" Keenly aware of what archives cannot not deliver, what their evidentiary forms foreclose in their endorsement of rights and representation, the plenitude of the Samaj's archive opens up the question of how we record histories of sexuality in many different keys. Now, I began my talk with a summoning of a historiography of sexuality that eschews, bypasses the language of loss as the structuring mode of its narration. What we have here in the archives of the Samaj is a story that stubbornly refuses to move on from the ordinary plenitude of sexuality. In this story, archival surplus repeats itself in a historical calculus, so minor, so unspectacular, that it does not appear to excite historical recuperation. These archives have been available for over 200 years, and no one has worked in them because they're available, accessible, and not oppositional in a conventional way, right? So it's worth thinking about. The archives of the Samaj, for example, as I just said, have not been read, circulated, or memorialized beyond a repeated reference to the glories of this Samaj as an aggressive, self-reforming collectivity. Such a historical elision is particularly telling because there is no mystery surrounding access to the archives, no governmental bureaucracies to accommodate. shorn of the aura of loss and oppositionality, we are confronted with a historiography that refuses to give up the paradoxes instantiated in the business of archiving. Presence without preservation, that's a paradox. Production without reproduction. What remains here then is the promise and failure of archival recuperation, the looking for, and a queer historiography about found archival objects that are so plentiful that one must look askance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anjali. I will introduce myself as I'm going to do a little presentation. I'm Carlos Motta, and I'm an artist that has been working with some of the topics that have already been raised. And what I want to do is show you a few clips of the films that are in view here in the gallery, and approach a series of questions that I have been thinking about as I was making the films. But before I do that, for those of you that have no context in terms of what the films are about, there are 4 films in view, 2 of which I'm going to talk about tonight, or just now. One is called Shipwreck, or Naufragios, and it tells the story of a Portuguese man called Luis Delgado, whose case exists in the archives of Torre de Tombo in Lisbon. I actually found this case in person, but also found a text by Brazilian anthropologist and LGBT activist Luis Motta that pieces together a narrative about the legal writing around his story. And I was fascinated by the ways in which the Portuguese crown was relentlessly sort of like pursuing the criminalization of sodomy. And this case exemplifies very well the ways in which he was prosecuted by the crown and sent in exile to Brazil as if to send him away and see how he behaved, where he actually continued to commit sodomitic crimes. So he was brought back to Lisbon, where he underwent a trial. It was hard for them to prove that he was 100% sodomitic. He was something like 70% sodomitic, because they couldn't find somebody to prove that he had actually ejaculated inside the other person's body, which absolved him from death, but he is ultimately sent in exile to Angola, which is a moment where he disappears from the archive, of course, and there is no more trace of him. The other film is called Deseos, and it is an epistolary relationship, both fictional and documentary, of 2 cases. One is the case of Martina Bhadra, which is the case I mentioned earlier Pablo had been working about, which was a woman in the early 19th century who was prosecuted for being a hermaphrodite. Her female lover, gave her up to the authorities, claiming that she had an abnormal body. So she undergoes a series of intensive examinations from the part of medical doctors, the police, to identify what is up with that body, what is wrong with that body. Together with Lebanese writer and anthropologist Maya Mikdashi, we conceived of a story where Martina would be given a voice in the same way that Luis Delgado is given a voice in the other film, and correspond with a fictional character called Nur, who is set in the Ottoman Empire, Beirut, in the same year, in 1803. And the story of Nur is slightly different. She is actually having a sexual relationship with a female friend, and is discovered by the mother in the midst of this relationship, and is tried in a kind of familiar way in the home by having them both marry each other's brothers respectively. So they continue to live together, they continue to have this homoerotic relationship, if we will, but they are both sanctioned by having to marry men and develop families with men. The reason why this case is a fictional case is because after a lot of research in some of the archives in Beirut, we could not find any legal cases that would document sort of quote-unquote lesbian relationship. And that's actually where I want to start my presentation, because unlike the presenters today, I am not necessarily a social scientist, and I wanted to allow myself a little bit of poetic license to approach some of these cases. And one of the things that became apparent to me was how limiting the lives of these queer characters was in the archives. How we learned about these stories under very specific legalistic terms and historiographical terms that reduce them to cases and not necessarily to lives. So in the case of Noor, for instance, I was interested in the fact that we could create a story that most likely took place at the same time, but that was never documented because institutionally there wasn't a system in place to document these kinds of stories, which erased them from a historical record, but most likely not from something that could have occurred.
Noor, si cierro los ojos me podría perder, me dices. Te siento presente. Las dos estamos prisioneras. Nuestras experiencias están enredadas a pesar de la distancia. Mis ojos también están cerrados. ¿Qué le pasa a mi cuerpo? Estoy acostada desnuda sobre una cama de madera muy incómoda, cubierta por una sábana áspera y fétida, y siento 4 manos sobre mí, dentro de mí, alrededor de mi cuerpo. Me están inspeccionando como si fuera carne cruda estos 2 hombres. Tocan cada centímetro de mi cuerpo y me fisgonean con autoridad científica. Cuando me permito abrir los ojos en pequeñas ranuras, los encuentro observándome con los ojos bien abiertos mientras me miden los senos, las caderas y hasta mis partes nobles. Me siento deshonrada, asqueada e incierta cuando insertan sus dedos dentro de mí. ¿Qué están buscando dentro de mí, Noor? ¿Le tienes miedo a Matt? ¿Te ha tocado en contra de tu voluntad? Los hombres siempre me han definido y desafiado. Como si no fuera suficiente el soportar el peso de sus patas sobre mi piel, sus preguntas inquisitorias también lastiman. Escuché que decían que soy antinatural, pero si Dios me ha otorgado mi cuerpo, ¿cómo puede ser entonces antinatural? Me preguntan si me crece de manera impropia cuando me tocan, sobre todo cuando me toca otra mujer, que si lo disfruto, que si estoy escondiendo algo extraño o que si he cometido algún acto inmoral. ¿A qué se refieren? ¿Hay algún secreto desconocido en mi vagina? Noor, yo solo espero que nunca te suceda lo mismo. A veces creo que a una mujer notable los suyos nunca dejarían que le hicieran algo así. Pero yo soy una mujer sola, humilde y sin una familia que me ayude a evitar estas deshonras. Háblame, Noor. Descifra este acertijo de violencia a partir de tu experiencia. Te deseo amor y superar la trampa en la que tú también te encuentras. Tuya más que nunca, Martina.
So this is towards the beginning of the film, where the two characters are starting to talk to one another. And the reason I wanted to show this particular clip to start with was, again, to speak about this question of the relationship between the historical document and a fantastical document that is produced off of it. Because one of the things that became apparent to me as I was reading this text was the language that was used to represent the character, right? It's a language that is, of course, always in third person, is very much objectifying of the life and the events that have structured the life of this character. And at the same time, there was this kind of, maybe an internationalist gay drive to identify this character with a lived experience, right? To give this character an identity that is not defined by those institutional constraints, but perhaps that is defined by the desire to have representative histories that are not conditioned by those forms of oppressive and repressive power. So in that sense, the question of turning these cases into fantasy was also a way of owning, reclaiming, or appropriating those forms of desire that had been pathologized by specific repressive motions. So now I'm going to show a clip of Noor to speak about a few other points.
أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله.
مارتينا، من يومين نحن بالحمام نورتني أمي أنا وعايشة عن الزواج، بس ما كان فيني فكر إلا إنه جسمي منه إلي لأعطيه ومنه لأحمد لياخده، هو العايشة. كان فيني حس بزعل عايشة لما كانت أمي عم تحكي وتمنيت إنه تطلع بعيدة عني. طبعاً كنا دايرين بالنا دايرين بالنا على المزبوط، ولما اجت سديت لها تمها بإيدي، عضتني واتنيناتنا ما صرخنا. حطتني بتمها وكان بدي الكل يعرف إنه أنا إلها وإنه جسمي بيتوجع وبيحلم يكون معها. وشو رح يصير؟ حداً رح يهتم؟ رح يشوفوا هالعلامة الحمراء على جلدي يلي هي منا أثار الأصابع اللي بشتاق اتركها على خصرة مثل التوقيع؟ رح يشوفوا هالاشياء مثلي وبيحمروا من الخجل؟ ولا رح يقولوا إنه هاي بس إشارة إنه هلأ نحن صرنا جاهزين للولاد، جاهزين إنه نكون نسوان مع رجال؟ إذا كنت مرة فهو لأنه عايشة عملتني مرة. الله يساعدني، عايشة اللي عملتني مرة. امبارح بالليل تخيلت إنه فيني أفركها على جلدي مثل ما بيفرك الواحد الزيت أو العنبر. ما قدرنا نوقف، نحن طايشات مثل الولاد الصغار يلي عم بيلحقوا بعض بالشوارع بآخرة الصيف، مثل يلي عم بدور على وقت ضايع. رح نتجوز الأسبوع الجاي. نور.
So one of the things that Maya and I started to think about was how, of course, these were stories of desire, but there were stories of desire that were perfectly unknowable, that we could only approach and own through our present-day experience. And that became a kind of drive for the writing of these stories, was, of course, the attempt at trying to represent that desire, which was in and of itself already a kind of trap. And one of those traps was this trope of tragedy, right, which is very common in the representation of queer lives historically. There's always this, the trope of tragedy, the story of repression, the story of a life that is not worth living, a story that only finds redemption through perhaps the rise of rights movement, etc., which has also very much been instrumentalized by the rights movement to fundraise and get notoriety and visibility and such. But we thought that this was actually an opportunity to own these desires through a different lens, and perhaps to not think so much about tragedy as the structuring device of these lives, but actually about something else, about the experience of those bodies in space, the experience of relationships that could have taken place in ways that would have never been documented. So this idea of the unnatural life or unnatural sex is something that we wanted to, of course, reference, because that's the way that they came to us in the first place, but in a way try to avoid them, try to create a historical fiction that would shift the ways in which we approach some of these bodies and the way that we have gotten to know them. So now I'm going to move to the other film, Naufragios, Shipwreck, which is the story of Luis Delgado. I'm going to show 2 short clips.
El tribunal de la Inquisición, sus ávidos espías, mis vecinos, mis vecinas, se han empecinado en definir lo que soy. Como si una persona fuera solo una cosa y no fuera un compendio ilimitado de posibilidades. Según sus leyes, soy un incorregible pederasta y mi comportamiento es una abominación contra natura. Pero yo soy una persona decidida a no mentirse a sí misma.
So the case that you see in the background is actually not Luis Delgado's case, but it's the King of Portugal's edict against sodomy. So it is in which he declares, in which it signs the resolutions against sodomy. But in thinking about both the case of Nur and Martina, and also about this drive of Luis to speak out his story, we were also thinking very much about contemporary intergenerational kind of networks of solidarity amongst queer people, and what that means, the possibility of having a Facebook group or some kind of GChat or, ways of communicating with others, and what that produces in terms of lives that would have otherwise been completely isolated and solitary. And so in thinking of that, in the case of Martina and Nur, for instance, this communication between them becomes a way of giving them a resource to live their lives, to have someone to communicate with in the ways that we do in contemporary times. And similarly with Luis, I was, this kind of drive to self-represent, to write his own story, to communicate what he is feeling, the way to resist the ways in which he has been historiographically represented, also became a way for me to think through ways of giving him an interlocutor that is not the sealed restricted, cold institutional space of the archive, but one in which, as the viewers of the film, can serve both as an ear but also as a form of identification. And in that sense, I think that my interest was very much refusing the idea that, and I think I already mentioned this before, of reducing these lives exclusively to cases, and actually give them a space beyond the space of the archive itself. There's another point that I wanted to raise regarding that, is this question of happy endings. Because both in, and I don't mean the Thai massage happy ending, but actually thinking of happy endings as the ends of these stories. In the case of Martina and Noor, for instance, they actually end up together. You know, they end up living a life together after many things happen. A husband dies, the other one raises the children of the other, etc. But it is a happy end in the end. And that, for Maya and I, in thinking about that film, was very important, thinking about how perhaps that is a point of departure to counteract this trope of tragedy that I spoke out at the beginning, but also very specifically a kind of political intervention onto the ways in which some of these lives and stories are thought about. And happiness in that sense is not just a kind of melancholic drive towards doing something else, but it actually becomes, in a way, a kind of political gesture in this wider field of representational traps that queer people have often been locked into.
En Bahía entendí los efectos del proyecto colonial. Cómo intenta domesticar los cuerpos y asignarles valor de acuerdo a la intolerancia inquisitoria. Los indios, los esclavos y los sodomitas somos calamidades públicas que deben ser disciplinadas. La tortura me ha convertido en lúcido. Ese momento en que el dolor es tan intenso que la vida se reduce a un grito de merced, es a veces seguido por una paz incomprensible. Me voy con las manos atadas y los pies encadenados. Me espera un trayecto largo hacia un continente y un pueblo desconocidos. A partir de hoy seré una serie de folios en un archivo. Me usarán como un ejemplo. Proyectarán ideologías sobre mi historia. La reconstruirán basándose en documentos legales, en crónicas, en inculpaciones. Desde hoy desapareceré de esta narración. Nadie sabrá de mí. No seré persona, ni criminal, ni sodomita. Mis palabras solo serán recuperadas por tu propio deseo de conocerte.
So then there's the question of conscious withdrawal from those spaces, and this kind of self-reflective ending of this narration, where he's saying how the story will only live on as a way for me or others that find it in the archive to kind of explain their own lives, became important to me. And that's also a part in one of the other films, Nefandus, where the voice also sort of like suggests that this is an exercise for me, the filmmaker today, to come to terms with my own relationship to these stories. But in thinking about, what does it mean to withdraw yourself from these experiences, right? Because of course, as he is sent in exile to Angola, he escapes any other form of documentation, and he goes into oblivion. And perhaps that is that act of involuntary withdrawal is actually a form of finding some kind of expressive or existential freedom of some sort for the character. So that was also something that I was really interested in thinking about, is how fiction could also allow us to think about those spaces like withdrawal or obscurity, or a self-conscious rejection of being brought to light as a form of reproducing that colonial violence in the first place. So I've been thinking about very much if this is a form of reproducing, the exercises that I'm doing with these historical fictions are also a form of reproducing somewhat those historical violences that these characters have been subjected to, and that are memorialized and archived in those archives. And what this project may mean. It is, as maybe perhaps how we were talking about earlier with Pete, if it is a form of reproduction or mitigating that very same violence. And I suppose this is something you're going to talk about in your presentation later. But in that case, I actually had dreams with some of these characters where they came to haunt me. Because I was subjecting them to another form of exposure, another form that is perhaps, that I could not escape, because I felt that it was my responsibility in a way to take them out of this violence that they had been subjected to. But am I subjecting them to another form of violence? That's something perhaps that we can talk about with some of these projects that you have been presenting now. And if that is a form of violence, is there some kind of mitigating factor for it that may justify it? Or am I just another form of complete, colonialist that is erasing the project? I don't think so. I mean, at least I'm conscious of it. But so it's of course a project that has raised issues, in the sense that it is not reliant on objectivity and kind of historiographically appropriate strategies, but it's actually very much relying on a kind of, I like to call it poetic license, so maybe that's not the right term, but certainly a way to approach some of these stories in a way that would give them a little bit more individuality and a sense of subjectivity, not necessarily have been always thinking about these lives in such objectively repressive terms. So I think that's what I have now. Maybe I can call you back both to have a conversation. Thank you. Are the microphones working? ¿Tú tienes algo, Pablo, o comienzo yo?
Sí, tengo unas preguntas.
Yo te traduzco.
No necesitamos, como usted quiere. ¿Eh?
Creo que no se necesita la traducción en este momento. Yo te traduzco. Dale.
Ok, empiezo. Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias por las presentaciones. Yo quisiera como introducir algunas preguntas como para empezar a movilizar el panel y de ahí como abrir la discusión como con el público.
Pablo would like to introduce some questions to get the conversation going and afterwards open a conversation up to the public.
Okay. Creo que ha aparecido pues como uno de los tópicos que siento como reiterativo en la mesa y de cierta forma también con Carlos y tiene que ver con la construcción de un discurso para hablar de la sexualidad que se ha construido desde un lugar liberal, digamos.
So Pablo is interested in or identifies a topic that he sees has been present in the three presentations, which is the construction of sexuality from a place of liberalism.
De cierta forma es el lugar de enunciación, digamos, liberal, europeo, que ha hablado de la sexualidad, que se inventó la sexualidad.
That place of enunciation which is liberal, European, which is the one that has constructed and invented sexuality as such.
Se ha convertido, pues ha generado toda esta tensión de poder hablar de esa alteridad que él mismo construye. ¿Sí?
Has created this tension to speak about this alterity that has also been constructed.
Y en ese sentido la pregunta es cómo poder construir unos diálogos precisamente transcontinentales.
So the question is how to construct transcontinental dialogues.
Desde lugares de enunciación que son tan distintos como podría ser Colombia o India.
From such different places of enunciation such as Colombia or India.
Pudiendo ir más allá de ese discurso que ha sido como el común, que tiene ese mismo origen liberal.
Attempting to transcend that discourse that finds its origin in that kind of liberal paradigm.
Pienso en esa dicotomía que ya había introducido Mohanty cuando hace su propuesta, digamos, de la necesidad de un feminismo transnacional.
He thinks of that dichotomy that was introduced by Mohanty when they speak about the necessity for a feminism that is transcontinental.
¿Cómo es posible pensarlo entonces sin volver a reedificar ese mismo lugar de enunciación inicial que termina poniendo las identidades que se inventó como ese lugar común para esa lucha transcontinental?
So how to think about that enunciation from a different place that may not reproduce that same place of enunciation but something else?
Sí, muchas gracias. All good questions.
Go ahead.
I'm happy to start us off, if I may, just because I recently just finished editing a special issue of GLQ, which for those of you in the audience who are not as well versed in these academic journal currencies, is the premier journal for queer studies in the United States. And one of the reasons why the special issue was of interest to us is because we wanted to do a conversation between queer studies and geopolitics, right? So we wanted to think about, while on the one hand, and I think Joseph has written extensively about this, there is a diversification in the language of capital in queer studies interests in going elsewhere to look for models, languages, exemplars. There is less attention to geopolitics, meaning places like South Asia, the Levant, South America, etc., as not places where we find avatars of difference, but rather where we find epistemologies, meaning new ways of asking questions, right? So I think that's been where we've been stuck for a long time. And I'm also somebody who doesn't work on the contemporary, which is another stranglehold of these questions of place. I think if you talk to anybody who works pre-19th century, none of these stabilities of place are possible, right? Because the language of sexualities is inevitably diverse, is slippery, is, you know, all of these things that we have writing about belatedly are the animus of the form, right? So I think the relationship of geopolitics, I would say geopolitics rather than transnational, because geopolitics calls attention to the formation of areas, geographies as staged subjects, right? And I think that's where we're stuck. It's still an exemplar, not an epistemology, right? So the questions I have for you, you know, after we have heard from the audience, have to do with that paradox for you, which I think you're still stuck at exemplar, right? And we can talk more about that. But I want to let Joseph respond to Pablo's questions as well, which I think are very timely. So,
thank you. Yes, Pablo, I think, the question of how do we approach a transnational kind of connection outside of the liberal perhaps begs the question of approaching it outside of the colonial, because clearly, what I think brings us all together is a colonial experience, right? Whether it's in Asia, Africa, or the Americas, and a kind of a European and American referentiality that I think seems to be constantly operating in these attempts at comparisons. And, one of the interesting things about, let's say, the fiction of Noor in the early 19th century Lebanon and your film is precisely that she's a fictional projection of the present onto a past that no one really, we can't really simply claim to be projecting sort of contemporary, this is what we do all the time, of course, but to project a contemporary sort of fantasy about what the past is like and then present it as perhaps having occurred but not been recorded. This is a wish of the present, not a wish of the past. But of course, and the issue is precisely that in the Ottoman world and the Muslim world, there were no such things. These cases did not appear as documentary or documentable precisely because they were not policed and they were...
Because they were ordinary. Yeah.
They were ordinary, exactly. And this is the thing, usually, often Islamophobes are very interested in early juridical opinion within the Islamic jurists' kind of world that condemns homosexual acts. However, in the archival historical studies that they've done, they could not find any cases throughout the centuries where people allegedly committing homosexual acts had been penalized based on these juridical judgments. So the search continues, of course, by those who are interested in finding these kinds of criminalized issues, but it hasn't been until, of course, the rise of certain kinds of Islamisms in the late 20th century and early 21st century. And even then, it's unclear also what's being prosecuted. Let's say what happened in Iraq in the last decade and a half. We're not really clear who is being prosecuted, what kinds of accusations are being thrown about against certain kinds of people for whatever political reasons that suddenly become identified as sexual. So, what do we do with the logic of comparison, with the logic of transnationalism? Is it possible to avoid these pitfalls? I'm not sure it is possible, in fact. So I do think vigilance is important all the time as to see how much of these attempts at comparison that outside of the colonial imposition of these things, to try to find common experiences or experiences that can become communal in a way across the colonized world is fraught with all kinds of, I think, epistemological, methodological, cultural pitfalls, which is not to say we should not attempt it, but also we should not pretend that we're not falling in them as we do them, it seems to me. So the vigilance is there, the awareness should always be present as we do these important, I think, comparisons, until we're able to, I think, rid ourselves of this sort of the hegemony of a liberal identification of the sexual in a way. And I think now, especially as these things have changed considerably across classes, and as the discourse on gayness has sort of gained some, let's say, visibility in certain classes, and even outside of them. Until now, of course, the attempt to produce straight, and here we're not only speaking about the Gay International, I want to also bring, of course, the important aspect of the Straight International. The attempt to produce people as straight and as heterosexual has been with us as long as the Gay, much longer, in fact, than the Gay International, whether it's through Hollywood or the European novel and romance and what have you. The attempt to heterosexualize the world has always been there, and is stronger perhaps than the Gay International, which is, the Gay International is a kind of a second lieutenant, so to speak, to this project. But nonetheless, it seems to me, so perhaps the project can pay more attention to the heterosexualization of the world, because it seems to me this is an important project that has not been as well studied, the attempt to produce bourgeois nuclear families. And this has been done through, the economic means, not only through epistemological, ontological means, but especially through the economic, the transformation of people's lives, the transformation of structures, the invention of certain kinds of the family, and then the transformation of that family. So I think there are different venues for how to pose these questions that I find often are not asked as much.
But I think there's also one last thing which I'm always disturbed by is asymmetry, imbalance. So those of us who work on the rest always complain about how we have to constantly translate. So if I say independence of India, most people, perhaps not here in audiences, wouldn't know when that was. If I said independence of the Philippines, which Americans should know, they don't. But most of us are sort of weary of that asymmetry. We're like, okay. But I think the asymmetry exists intra-South-South conversations as well. I think when you say comparative, I think it's more important for us to have South-South comparative conversations rather than North-South or East-West, however you map those geographies. I think those have been lacking. So I think this event, for example, is a great intervention in those conversations. So most South Asianists will know a lot about Latin America, but very few Latin Americanists know anything about South Asia. Which I think, again, it's not a punitive comment. It's a comment of interest. Why is that the case, right?
But is there a case for arguing against these comparative strategies that you're talking about?
You cannot if you work on empire.
Wait. In the sense that they may be the undercurrent might as well be a colonial framework. Because I'm just trying to think of a few things. The first is the relationship between present and past, and how what we have today brings us back to these archives, in your case, to understand certain episodes, in my case, to project certain desires onto these older cases, which I think in and of itself is a framework that is defined by a colonial relationship to the archive and to knowledge. And I have a sense that these transnational comparisons are also based on frameworks that are based on Eurocentric notions about producing knowledge. Maybe not all the time, but which is also the case with the rights movement and the rise of the rights movement, etc. Right? This idea that the experience of a gay in New York or Miami may relate to the experience of a gay in Bombay or elsewhere.
No.
I just want to say that even all the South-South conversation still takes place through the sort of academic lingo of sort of Europe and the United States. It still takes place, as this one does, through the language of Europe in a certain way. That at the same time, we cannot ignore the fact that the South also sees other parts of the South through the eyes of the European and American world. After all, much of what the Chinese know about Africa or Latin America, they get also from historically from European and American television stations and press agencies. Much of what Arabs know about Latin America and what Latin Americans know about Arabs is also informed by a Western view. So in many ways, the very epistemology, even ontology through which we understand each other in relation to other parts of the South is mediated through.
For sure, but I don't think
there were attempts otherwise. There were attempts, of course, at solidarity through, in the colonized world at the political level. I think perhaps the Bandung Conference or the non-aligned movement would have been political attempts at crossing these boundaries. Attempts today in the academy, I think, as doing comparative colonialisms, try to attempt to do this, but we cannot, I don't think even these conversations across the South can happen outside the modalities that the American Academy or the European Academy, as well as media, have made possible.
For sure,
but
you introduce other currencies of circulation. Yes. I think this fantasy of being outside of mediation is an impossible one.
I fully agree.
So I'm very fatigued by the constant demand being made, especially since I work on non-English sources, to provide a kind of vernacular counterpoint to the hegemonic one. There isn't, right? So if you look at the word race, it comes from the Portuguese understanding of casta, which comes through caste from India. That history is lost, so I could tell you that, but that's still another mediated form, right? So I think I'm less interested in how we get out of mediation, but more interested in how we attenuate the recognitions that mediation has given to us, that have become habits for us, right? So my question to you, Carlos, would have been, if it's all right, and then I will, is I really enjoyed, I had the pleasure of watching your work because you had sent it to me with some care. So I wanted to ask you, is in some ways I feel like you're setting up a straw man, as it were. The official archive is also a fantasy, right? So as your reproduction of it. So why stay committed to this narrative of your work being phantasmatic and the archive that you are writing against or writing without being non-phantasmatic? I think that seems like your hoist by your own petard, right? I mean, so I think the work it lends itself to calling attention. Remember, what you see in the archive is what is left behind, not what was, right? That's the first thing you know. So it's a management imaginative of what the world was imagined by the colonial, whoever it is that the. So I think that was my question for you. I was struck by your insistence on your.
You mean by my speaking now or in the work itself?
But in the work itself, because there's this plangent, desire for finding a way to smuggle out of these strangleholds, right? But those strangleholds were also imaginative strangleholds. Nothing was. So, I was sort of a little bit, wanted to hear more.
Sure. I mean, I guess there is the recognition that those imaginative strangleholds that you talk about have become so predominant and dominant that they have defined the ways in which we have understood our identities and our bodies. So there is a certain sense of, even if you recognize that as something that that is also phantasmatic, there is a truth of a very dominant weight to it, and which is the one that I wanted to bounce off of, in the sense that it would be the place where you could create these other kinds of fantasies and fictions in response to. I don't know that I'm like revering to it in a way that is, that considers it to be true, that those specific narratives, but actually I think that I wanted to understand that they have a specific weight in history, especially in the form of religion and legality, that present themselves as real in ways that define people's experiences both individually and collectively.
Thank you.
Do we have some questions in the audience for anyone? I know it's.
I think.
Okay.
Tobias? Should we give him a... Hello?
I think, Carlos, a lot of the questions that, or what came up in your discussion about your own work, or it made me think back on the other presentation, just, within questions of subjectivity and historical archives and facts, how do each of you negotiate, how do you set up rules for how you use the material? I mean, you were talking about that a little bit, Carlos, but sort of what limits, what sort of borders do you set on the lines between sort of fact, subjective, history, where do you draw those lines for yourself? And I'm not saying they're fixed, I'm just asking how you each define your own limits of how you use the material you're working with.
I'll tell you my experience of one of the books that I wrote on the question. I wrote a book called Desiring Arabs back in 2007, and I wrote it kind of reluctantly. I didn't want to write the book. It had been something on my mind ever since I came to college in the United States, and people began to speak to me about sexual identities that I just could not relate to, and I just didn't understand what they were referring to. And then increasingly, and I decided that actually I would begin to get more upset about the rise of a certain kind of discourse on sexual rights and sexual identities, especially in the Arab and Muslim world. And I thought, well, if I am a proper Foucauldian and I understand what they're doing, if I were to help, I would be helping them incite a discourse rather than, and if I'm thinking this is the problem, then I shouldn't partake in this whatsoever. Then, of course, the discourse expanded and expanded. I was now in graduate school. I graduated. I finished a couple of books, and then the situation was beginning to be, many of my friends said, well, listen, this discourse is being incited universally, whether you like it or not. So if you want to have a say in it, do something. So I began with, initially I began with a critique of this incitement to discourse in the West in the 1980s and 90s on this question. And then I realized that in order for me to situate this particular critique, which became a cause célèbre, people sort of became a big polemic that people sort of responded to also polemically, I decided to produce sort of a history of, you know, what is this, what existed at least as an intellectual discourse in the Arab world specifically before the intervention of these Western sort of sexual missionaries, and what has become the effect at both intellectually and politically in the light of this intervention. So I began to look at a large sort of body of work. There's been no archive. There's been conversations and references to questions of sex and sexuality in the Arab world since the late 19th century in response to Western and Orientalist accusations that the Arab world was full of pederasty and sodomy historically, and they were profligate and libertine, and yeah. So and the response was mostly in the form of apologia, but at the same time I realized when I began this project it was simply an Arab intellectual history about the question of modernity, and you know, suddenly I realized that all the major Arab intellectuals, historians, psychologists, literary critics had in fact had something to say about the question of sexual desire in the medieval Arab world, how they were reconstructing the history of the medieval Arab world. So in fact, in a way, I was constituting an archive in doing this book, which had not existed before. And so I was risking, in fact, creating, you know, an archive. And I basically read everything from the 1870s on how the modern Arabs were trying to create a history of the medieval Arabs while responding to European histories. And then at the end of this project, people were complaining to me that, well, you don't tell us anything about the contemporary Arab world. And I'm very careful about not playing native informant, right? Let alone, I mean, so on the one hand, people still would complain after the book came out that I don't tell them how Arabs desire or have sex, which of course, it's something that I'm not interested in doing. And of course, I would be incapable of doing. I would think anyone would be incapable of doing. I'm not sure I can tell you how I desire. I mean, I'm too psychoanalytically inclined to even claim that I would know. So the point being that I decided to look into another archive, which was fiction. And I thought fiction could, since I'm doing an intellectual history and I'm not an anthropologist and I'm not interested in telling anyone how people are having sex, I was interested in how contemporary fiction tells us how people are having sex. So it was about, again, representation of sexual desire and practices in fiction. So this way I avoided the trap that I always attack others on not avoiding, which is playing native informant about what is actually happening anthropologically through different kinds of ethnographies of how people, you know, practice sex. Because I was only interested in showing how contemporary intellectuals represent how people are having sex. And therefore, much of my book was, all the book was a history of the representations of sexual desire and practices, not a history of sexuality, not a representation itself of sexuality, but a study of those representations of sexuality. That was the limit that I set to myself.
I think my response is less nuanced. I think when I started thinking about histories of sexuality, I have been writing about this for quite some time. I was always sort of amused by the question that I would get asked, especially because I work in South Asia, 18th, 19th, and early 20th South Asia, is how can you write a history of sexuality when there is no evidence, right? How do you write a history of sexuality when the archive is empty? And so I think the limits and balancing acts that you're asking about have been about thinking about that question, is what constitutes archival evidence, how is an archive understood to be an archive, and what do we need in order for an archive to be recognized, which is what I was trying to talk about today, right? And I think one of the kind of cautionary tales that has emerged from my own sort of working in the archives for over 25 years now is you know, not to do the hermeneutics of suspicion, which is something that I think we still do, right? Which is that there's something hidden that we will find, uncover, write about, and provide, but rather to think, you know, about sexuality as not extraordinary, right? Or as peripheral or spectral. These are the forms like loss that we are used to thinking about sexuality, right? That it is not something that is there, it is something that is hidden, erased, elided, disappeared. And I wanted to not oppose that necessarily, but think, what if we let go of that, right? What if sexuality is the ordinary in the most robust sense of the word? What if it is everywhere in the most robust sense of the word? Then what happens to our forms of recognition, right? So what would happen, Carlos, to your phantasmatical archive if you didn't use the archival traces that are overdetermined as the archival traces of sodomy or transgender, etc., right? What other stories could you tell of sexuality? So I think that's been my, which is why the book that I'm writing about now is not about sodomites or homosexuals. My first book was, but it's a book to me that is much more queer than the first one, because it's asking us to think about how do we write histories that don't reproduce in a straightforward way, but in fact call attention to how do we reproduce knowledge, which is to me a queer project. So it's not about identities, but it is about the questions I think that you're struggling with too, is how do I write or portray or think about something in a way that undoes the forms that I've inherited. You can't let go of them, but how can I, unmoor myself a little bit? The weight still is on you.
Sure, I mean, that for me is very relevant with the installation of little figures here. And it's something that I have been thinking about a lot, which is, of course, that there is an appropriation of several things. There is a first layer of appropriation of some historical objects that represent homoerotic encounters in different pre-Hispanic groups throughout the Americas. Then the miniaturization of those things to render them perhaps more visible in the sense that they have largely been kept outside of historical narratives, records, histories of sexuality, with some exceptions, of course, your work, Pete. And then there is the appropriation of the form of the museum, with these kind of museological vitrines, the glass, the backlit presentation, etc., as to render them institutional and established, but at the same time recognizing that it's a completely fabricated history that could not exist. So in my fantastic mind, this is the most comprehensive exhibition of pre-Hispanic homoerotic objects ever presented, right? It's a kind of retrospective of these objects that maybe could never take place because a lot of these objects were destroyed, there's no documentation, the archive is largely empty. So I think that my relationship to that fantasy perhaps is not to reconstruct everything, but actually to appropriate those institutional forms of presentation and use them to construct that fantastical history that speaks about conditions both of the present and perhaps flirts with understanding the ways that some of these behaviors existed in the past. But obviously claims not to own them or understand them. But
Carlos, I also thought that, at least in one of the films that I saw of yours, that you actually are interested in also showing, perhaps, or in trying to record historical instances before sexuality. That's right. Right, and this is, I think, a very important methodological issue and an epistemological issue that I struggle with, and I have a strong line on, and I continue sort of that discussion in my last book, Islam and Liberalism, precisely that unlike many colleagues in the field who seem to treat sexuality as a universal given. So basically sexuality is universal, but it has different cultural manifestations where it occurs. So it functions differently in what we call India or what we call the Arab world or South America, but it itself as a category, as a category of experience, as a category of ontology is universal. I contest that. I actually insist that sexuality is a European cultural form that is not universal, that the rest of the world does not have a sexuality and has not had a sexuality, just like Europe did not before the invention of sexuality. That what we have rendered is an attempt to capture sexual desires, pleasures, corporeal pleasures, and practices under this capacious umbrella called sexuality, when in fact it does not exist elsewhere in the same way. Despite the colonial attempt to impose it in certain parts of the world, it has failed miserably in doing so across the world, which is precisely why the human rights sexual missionaries insist on reproducing it elsewhere. So for me then, it's not a matter that the Arab world has a different manifestation of sexual desires or of sexuality, but rather it does not have a sexuality. And that the extent to which parts of it do today or certain classes partake of it is very much part of this attempt at universalizing it institutionally, economically, in literature, in every possible way.
Yeah, absolutely. For me, it was really about the moment of naming rather than a representational act on of these sexualities in the sense. But actually the moment in which there is a certain complicit act in the conquest where things get named and thus constructed in those categories that we have come to use up to the present.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think this is super incredible what you guys are doing here, and very needed. My name is Charo Ked, and I am an artist, and I'm currently working actually on a video on the Gaga, which is a ritual in the Dominican Republic that comes from Rara. It's kind of a carnival. And I am looking at the LGBT community, especially trans community within this. And one of the things that I, feel that, not enough has been spoken about class in this issue, because I think class here really determines a lot of different things, and I would like to hear more about that, how you feel. And the other thing about the Americas being that we are such a mixture, especially the Caribbean. We have a lot of the Arab coming from, Spain, so a lot of our sort of culture is very much Arabic and, Black. So, I'd like to hear a little bit more of that if you can. Thank you.
Maybe we take a couple more.
Okay, let's take a couple and we'll respond to both of them.
So first of all, thank you all for this really, if I think about the archives of my experiences, this has been a really thrilling morning, so thank you. I'll try to be brief. I have a specific question for Professor Massad. It'll be difficult for me to be brief because this is actually a really special moment for me. You don't know it, but we've had a complicated relationship for a long time in my head. I say that, yeah, sorry. So I'm an
What is your name? You didn't tell us your name.
My name's Jason Ritchie. I'm an anthropologist, and I work mostly in Israel-Palestine and with queer Palestinians. And so, of course, your work has been enormously influential and provocative and inspirational to me. But I have a question. On the one hand, of course, your criticism of the racism of so many white North American and European lesbian and gay activists and institutions, and their complicity in projects of violence against both internally and state violence, internally and externally, I mean, of course, I cannot argue with that, nor with the sort of symbolic importance that homophobia and tolerance of homosexuality have assumed in all of these Islamophobic discourses and so on. So my problem, though, is I worry that your narrative of the missionary project of the Gay International is a little overdetermined and simplistic, and may...
Simultaneously.
Sorry?
Overdetermined and simplistic simultaneously.
Yeah. I make no pretensions to consistency. And well, maybe that's part of why I said our relationship is complicated, right? But I say that because I, despite all of my agreement with everything that all of your criticisms, I worry that in some ways this pretty straightforward narrative of the missionary project of the Gay International relies on a very particular notion of culture or civilization, as you sometimes use it, a concept that is actually no longer even accepted by those who developed the concept, anthropologists, as this sort of static, or sometimes static, definitely bounded thing. And so in this story that you tell us, Arabs confronted with the Gay International basically have two choices: to convert to these Western sexual epistemologies, or to resist and continue engaging in and conforming to presumably more authentic local sexual epistemologies. That, I think, is a profound misunderstanding of how the world actually works and how people's lives actually work. And so, to conclude, just I'll mention two examples that I think are illustrative. First of all, a historical example. You mentioned Paul Bowles and many of the sort of white gay Orientalists who were racist and Orientalist and problematic in all kinds of ways. But Paul Bowles, as you know, of course, had an interesting relationship with Muhammad Shukri, who, well, I won't recount all of the details of it, but Muhammad Shukri would become an important Moroccan writer. He did not become a self-identified gay man. So the result of this encounter was not quite, it was not as straightforward as the results that you seem to predict. And sorry, to conclude, the last sort of example that is much closer to me, many of the queer Palestinians that I know, people who sometimes identify as queer or as lesbian or as gay or in categories that you seem to associate with a very Western sexual culture, they're at least in my understanding, and as they speak to me about their lives and their experiences and their desires and their activist projects, none of that can be reduced to this simple dichotomy of either conforming to some externally imposed sexual epistemology or resisting and continuing to be authentic. So, sorry. All of that is said in love. And
I think that maybe that's enough. We can...
Could I answer? Okay.
Yes, but
well, I mean, I'll try to get down to the real question. First of all, of course, I mean, you've made claims that you think I make. I have no investment in the authentic. Gay internationalist critics are very interested in attributing to me things I have never said. And I have responded to this before in writing and in lectures that, on the contrary, not only do I historicize the term culture and civilization and show how Arab intellectuals came to adopt it and to create something called Arab culture, Arab civilization and its history. This is precisely the whole first part of my book on Desiring Arabs. And two, I have, the question for me is not some kind of a dichotomy, some mechanistic dichotomy between something called the authentic and something called the foreign, but rather actually constantly I'm interested in how Western norms are being imposed violently through a number of mechanisms elsewhere. This is not only about suppressing what exists. What exists is not authentic in the Arab world. It is always dynamic and practices change. Indeed, I try to show this even in literature, where we suddenly see a transformation of representation of men having sex from an older man who is penetrative seeking a younger man who is penetrable, to the more recent representation of an older man being penetrable seeking a younger man from a working class background to penetrate him. So in fact, this is very, very, I mean, the Arab cultural representations, even in the last 40 to 50 years in the novels, are quite dynamic and changing. There is no attempt to fix this. What there is, the critique of, is of a kind of a Western nativism and claim to authenticity, a Western understanding that they represent human liberation and their way is the only way and everything else is lesser, and that they are successful when they convert others to their notion of what the human should be. So that, for me, is not only rhetorical, but also imposed through institutions, through governmental policies, etc. So that, for me, is an issue. There is no mechanistic question. I never discuss what Arab men or women should choose or not choose. I am interested in already existing organizational structures of this, right? That there basically is, one Lebanese organization that is funded by Western organizations for the purpose of creating a Lebanese gay community. I am interested in an Israel-based Palestinian organization that also is funded by Western, usually Islamophobic and Arab-phobic organizations and countries, that also says on its website it seeks to build a gay community. So these are not organizations that are there to fund an existing community, but precisely to build one, as they claim themselves to be saying, and as their funders want them to do. So these are not organic organizations that have come up in the Arab world any more than in India or elsewhere, but in fact, and as we know even the structure of how they come to be. So, a white sexual tourist or a human rights activist suddenly comes on the scene, is able through now the internet find a number of men or women who are interested, who see their sexual desires and practices as outside the norm, and asks them if they have an organization. And when they say they don't because they don't have money, they say it's very interesting. It's very easy, rather. You just sort of put in an application, you register your organization, then we will help you. You will begin to send funding requests for all of us, and we will give you the funding, and then it becomes a local organization, even though the funder, the idea, and the way it came to be, in fact, came to be through these sexual tourists that go there for the precise aspect of this. Now, all of this is fine, of course, but it also merits critique and observation. And I'm not interested in necessarily in the minority of men and women in the Arab world or in India or in African countries who end up adopting these different identitarian sort of labels from the West. I am interested in how they want to impose it on everybody else in society. The problem with the Gay International is, actually it's not a problem, where we agree is that they recognize, as I do, that the majority of Arabs or of Indians or of Africans who practice same-sex and different-sex contact refuse to identify as gay or straight. That is the issue. And the problem is that they want to speak for them, that these organizations insist on speaking for them, and that's my critique.
Wait, easy.
Now, the question of class is very important, just to respond to the other question. The question of class is extremely important precisely because while parts of the upper class and the middle classes, including the lower middle classes, are being sort of converted to this discourse of sexual identities. And that is, of course, normal because this is, and especially with the capitalist penetration of the world economy in the last 100 years, people's lives have been transformed. There's nothing particularly different about sexual norms being also transmitted and adopted. Indeed, Western pornography is teaching people certain kinds of sexual practices around the world through its availability now even on sort of cell phones for the poor who might even be illiterate but are able to access different kinds of representations. Now, however, of course, it seems that the institutionalization of the identitarian framework is not working in the same way that it has in the West. So as a result, for example, the term gay, while now is understandable in contemporary middle class and upper class lingo across the Arab world, what it means is very different of what it means here. It often means passive homosexual. It does not mean someone who engages in sex with other men. It means someone who engages with sex with other men in a certain capacity as a passive partner. And it does not mean that this particular man is not interested in women, for example. So it is not an exclusive identification. So when people now even use the shorthand, the Western shorthand as gay, often it doesn't mean what it means in the West. So it also, there's an important sort of méconnaissance.
Just to add to what Joseph is saying, to give a concrete example, I don't know if this will do the critical labor of what you're saying, but for example, in India, where we have a law which was instituted by the British, which has been overturned and turned back again. It's Section 377, which is called the Anti-Sodomy Statute as a shorthand. When the first repeal against the statute was submitted, it was submitted by Naz Foundation, which is a very resolutely middle-class North Indian organization, but the cases they used to submit the repeal were of working class MSM, men who have sex with men who were sex workers. So even for the short period when the section was overturned and people were celebrating all over India that we had finally gotten rid of this horrific sodomy statutes, the people who benefited from that were middle-class people, because the working-class men and women who had same-sex and trans subjects were still being criminalized by the police for prostitution, right? So I think the class issue is important from the languages of normativization that it provides, the way Joseph is saying, but it's also about who are the subjects in whose voice these organizations speak and allow themselves to be heard. They're always representing the working class, right? And I know in South Asia, this is the critique that feminists have been making for a long time of queer organizations, because the masses are always invoked, but the privileges are encased in a particular class formation.
And when police repression is incited, the poor are the ones who are victimized the most, because the middle class and the rich always have exit strategies. Right? So basically the poor end up being victimized and being identified with identities that they never chose as a result of this middle class incitement.
I would like to bring in Pablo to this conversation, because a lot of the work that Pablo has been doing outside of his academic work is working with the armed conflict and people that have demobilized from guerrilla groups in Colombia. Entonces te quería preguntar si puedes hablar de la relación entre las políticas LGBT en los proyectos que has estado haciendo con los desmovilizados de la violencia en Colombia y del conflicto armado. ¿Cómo son los temas de clase, relaciones de clase y raza en relación a las políticas, digamos, institucionales LGBT?
Bueno, como un poco intentaré en el tiempo de la tarde, creo que un poco la discusión que he intentado seguir con un poco de éxito completo. Hay un asunto que tiene que ver con la forma. Siento que de todas formas las académicas, lo que hemos hecho es que hemos traspolado como a diferentes contextos la forma yo le llamo como el régimen burgués de sexualidad, digamos.
He thinks that academics sometimes have shifted what he calls the bourgeois regime of sexuality.
Y siento que en dos contextos muy distintos ocurre lo mismo. Uno, pues en los que he trabajado, el contexto del conflicto armado y los sectores LGBT.
And in two contexts, the same thing is taking place. One is in the context of the armed conflict from an LGBT perspective.
Y lo mismo con el contexto colonial.
And the same with the colonial context.
Y es que como el discurso de los human rights, digamos, es el lugar desde el cual se hace esa lectura.
Because the discourse of human rights is the place from which you do the reading.
Termina por no comprender
It doesn't understand
las formas específicas en las cuales son significados y vividas esas experiencias de sexualidad en contextos específicos.
Because it fails to recognize the ways in which lives are lived and experienced from those very specific contexts.
Entonces lo que nos encontramos, por ejemplo, en el libro Aniquilar la diferencia es que este marco liberal para poder comprender los derechos no era suficiente para comprender por qué se agenciaban ciertas violencias en los territorios.
So that liberal framework from which a reading of rights is produced is definitely not enough to understand the experiences of those violence in very specific contexts.
Y eso lo encontramos en una crítica a la idea del crimen por prejuicio, donde cuando un actor armado mata, por ejemplo, a una mujer transgénero.
And they found that in a critique of in a reading of crime for prejudice crime or hate crimes, where, for instance, when somebody that is involved in the armed conflict kills a transgendered woman,
se cree que la mató porque tenía un prejuicio.
They believe that he or she killed her because he or she had a prejudice.
Y lo que hemos querido criticar es que el concepto de prejuicio
And what they want to criticize is that the concept of prejudice itself
es insuficiente
insufficient
para poder comprender cómo funcionan o el papel de esas violencias en la construcción de órdenes sociales específicos.
And that the prejudice itself as a concept is insufficient to understand the ways in which those violence have been generated specifically.
Y lo mismo, digamos, para el contexto colonial, en el cual precisamente la ubicación de todo el problema sobre unas identidades específicas.
And the same thing within the colonial context, where the fixture on the... Repítelo.
Todo este discurso se ha basado como en tomar como unidad de partida unas identidades específicas, que en la realidad
where the discourse departs from taking grasp on specific identities
que fuera de las clases medias
that would be middle classes,
no las encontramos.
and that were not found outside of the middle classes were not found.
Por ejemplo, encontramos una continuidad muy grande entre las formas de sexualidad entre actores armados con personas LGBT, es decir, incluso relaciones sexuales, pero la pregunta es cómo
They
terminaban
found, for
luego
instance, relationships between actors of the armed conflict with LGBT people, including sexual relationships, but the question is,
en, por ejemplo, un asesinato, una tortura. ¿Sí? Entonces,
how does that reconcile itself with a killing or torture?
No quisiera adelantar, pues, digamos, esa parte porque es de la tarde, pero lo que quisiera decir es que digamos que el llamado entonces, como de una historia de la sexualidad, creo que consiste en poder comprender esas formas en que se construyen esos significados que no responden precisamente a esa idea liberal de sexualidad.
So basically he's calling for a history of sexuality that does not respond specifically to that liberal framework of sexuality.
Y introducir como el último ejemplo, cuando hacíamos el ejercicio como el trabajo de campo,
When they were doing field work,
yo planteaba algo así como: a mí se me parece mucho más una mujer transgénero a una mujer desplazada con 3 hijos.
he thought to himself that he always thought that transgender woman, for instance, resembled much more a displaced woman with 3 kids
Que a un hombre gay de Medellín.
than a gay man from Medellín.
Es decir, hemos establecido como hemos diseccionado mal el objeto que hemos construido.
We have dissected incorrectly the object that has been constructed.
Porque en las experiencias de violencia lo que encontramos es que había más comunicación real
Because in the experiences of violence, they have found that there has been a truer and more specific communication
con otras identidades que iban más allá de la identidad sexual o
with
de
other identities that transcend the LGBT or sex identity. Do we have any?
Yes, we have 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for a very interesting panel. My name is Ricardo Zulueta, and I'm an artist and an academic. And one of the things that struck me so far is the different ways that academics mine the archive and artists mine the archive. And so that's kind of interesting to me. And I was wondering, I'm thinking about Elizabeth Freeman's book, Time Binds, where she talks about queer temporalities and chrononormativity. And I'm wondering what role Carlos' artistic license plays in how you interpret the object from the archive in your work, specifically as it refers to time. And I wanted to ask the academics on the panel the same thing. When you talked about the object and the archive and looking for proof, I was wondering how, a chromonormativity or the establishment of European American time and how you interpret the object through that lens or without or outside of that.
One more question here.
This is directed more towards Carlos, but Anjali, you were talking kind of about a narrative becoming real, not necessarily through truth, and I use that word loosely as we've discussed, but kind of what's produced from its existence. So like kind of the dramatization of a story, then it becomes a tangible school that still exists. So my question is, what do you hope to produce through your constructive narrative? Like, what do you hope for the future?
Do you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I know Beth's work quite well, and she's a colleague and friend, and I think the book is very helpful, but I think the questions it asks are emergent out of American studies. I mean, so even the kind of ways in which she understands temporality assume lack of simultaneous temporalities, right? That the argument she makes is that a queer temporality gives you that idea, but anyone who doesn't work on the West will tell you that the idea of temporality is always unhinged and is not a stable form, right? So a simple example would be, I have 3 birthdays, one according to the Indian calendar, Hindu calendar, the Muslim calendar, and the Christian calendar, right? So there are forms of temporality that are ordinary, that are divergent and multiple, that exist in the construction of the very archive itself, right? So the reading that she provides, which is enormously useful, assumes that those multiple divergent forms are added through reading, right? And I would say that they're always already there. And I think that's simply, again, geopolitical asymmetries, right? And it's not necessarily a critique, but it's a question to think about. Even as we produce these new innovative forms, we reproduce geopolitical asymmetries. We don't learn from elsewhere, we learn from the here and there, right? So it's not necessarily an answer to your question, but it's just a cautionary tale, right? Is that the embrace of an analytical form must be understood through its geopolitics. Ideas come from places, then they become places themselves, right? So I'm doing this teacherly thing and telling you need to read more, so.
Yeah, I think there, in the case of the films and the projects that I have done, for me, the question of time is simultaneous and synchronic in a way, because the projects are situated in a distant past, but to me they very much speak about the present, and they speak about that my place of enunciation of the conditions of the present through taking some license to understand some conditions that took place in the past. So in the construction of the film itself, the relationship between the images and the text are completely disassociated, right? You have a person that is speaking in 1803, but you have a woman that is crossing the street with taxi cabs in Bogota in 2016. And I think those 2 layers for me are very important to signal that they're not works that are attempting to do a kind of historically accurate or chromo-accurate relationship of the past, but actually to situate them in the present tense, to speak about the conditions of the present, the voice that is articulating those concerns now, and hence all of these kind of like self-reflective monologues that occur in the films that were, of course, very self-consciously written, to situate that back in the present tense. And in that sense, to respond to your question, I think that what I'm trying to do is that, it's speak about how can we use all of these documents and things that exist in these specific archives to understand conditions of the present for the viewer and for me and the people that are engaging the work, to understand those, that the act of naming, the act of constructing these categories, and more the internalizing of these categories and their expression as something that has conditioned the ways in which we see ourselves and we present ourselves.
I have one more question.
Did you want to respond to this?
Just briefly on the object of the archive, I mean, I think just to echo what Anjali had said earlier, that in my specific book on the question of representations of sexuality and desiring Arabs, nothing was hidden. Like I said, every single major Arab historian, psychoanalyst, literary critic, literary historian, all had touched on the topic, which very interestingly, and nothing was sort of hidden from history in a way. I didn't find anything hidden. One of the major controversies was about how to deal with one of the most important Arab poets of the medieval period, sort of the 8th and early 9th century, that the Orientalists had already accused of being sort of a sodomite and a profligate person. So you had amazing amounts of writings on him, including psychoanalytic studies of his personality and what have you, from the 40s and the 50s of the 20th century, and other books from the 1930s and 20s, those claiming that in fact he wasn't, those who claimed, yes, indeed he engaged in these kinds of things. Others said that actually he lied by saying he slept with men or boys, so that, when in fact he liked women. And it was a very, very interesting sort of lively debate that I registered, but none of it was actually hidden, and it was everywhere. In every kind of book on any topic that I read that was published between 1880 and 2000, and some was references to this. So there was no specific books, right? And suddenly we begin in the 1940s because of and 1950s, because of a certain heightening of the discourse on sex internationally, you begin to see books specific and sort of clear books by established historians with titles like Sex in Islam, or and things of that sort, or about sort of standards of women's beauty in medieval Arabic literature, or and even some forms of pride. How many sexual positions medieval Arab writers had described, which sort of outdo the West at the multiple sexual positions they described. So it was a very interesting kind of research to do at the time, and there was, again, I had very little to do in terms of archaeological digging to find the stuff. It was everywhere. And no one had sort of, I mean, of course, the problem was that I was, as I had feared, helping to incite the very discourse I was reacting to, because in a sense, by saying, yes, this is the moment that I'm writing from, a moment of heightened incitement against the Arab world and Muslims on the question of sexuality, a moment of heightened incitement on sexual identities and rights. And of course, I tried to show that most of these people who engage in these things or who wrote about them did not consider sexuality the truth of oneself, the inner truth lodged in someone's heart, but one of the pleasures and desires that one had, like any of the other appetites that one had, that did not define oneself or the truth of who one was, right? So that was the epistemological response, in a way, or even ontological response, that, you know, loving okra does not make one an okra lover that's lodged in his heart.
I think we have time maybe for one more question, actually.
Yes, I just wanted to ask Anjali to speak to, okay, so I'm thinking about maybe the 4 keywords that were circulating in your comments throughout the morning. So I'm persuaded by this archival abundance and what we see in the quotidian, and then the geopolitical formations, right? And so I wanted to see what do we see on the ground in this Portuguese Indian community? What kind of South-South relations or contacts, like how is that embodied? So beyond, who do we get to see? I don't want to say who I'm expecting to see, but I guess I think that if we got to hear a little bit more about the bodies on the ground, we might actually see things that we don't expect to see, especially in terms of the geopolitical formations you're talking about.
That's a great question. We had the pleasure of being on a panel together at MLA, so I'm sorry to inflict more of myself on you. But your question is great, so I'll answer it in 2 ways. The one is because, of course, of the brevity of my comments, I couldn't say more about the actual histories of these communities. So remember, more slaves crossed the Indian Ocean than the Atlantic Ocean, right? This is a historical fact. So this community has a multiple set of histories which come from histories of slavery. So in the 17th, 18th, and even up to the early 19th century, there are African slaves brought from places like Mozambique into Goa, but there are also Goan Indian slaves that exist at the same time. And some of those come from this community. The other more interesting thing for me is the fictionality of the community's history itself. So what I mean by that is because these Devadasis were sex workers, they serviced not just the Brahmins, they serviced all kinds of people. So you have people running around Goa and Maharashtra, which is the 2 big states who have surnames that could be linked to anyone. So you see people who have light skin, you see people who have light blue eyes, you have people who have very dark skin, but none of them are interested in knowing who their fathers are. So this is a leitmotif. So the romance of the family is missing. I've written about this in another essay. So if you ask any of these communities, even to this day, even though the practice has now been discontinued and a lot of these descendants have been married, no one is interested in finding out who their real father is. They're interested in imagining it. So I'll end with a very simple example. So when I was doing research in June, to finish it up, I was sitting in the archives where it's like a marketplace, right? People coming in and out. And a young, well, not young compared to me, a woman came in and said she wanted to speak to the secretary because she needed a caste certificate, which is like affirmative action. Getting a caste certificate would allow you access to reservations for seats because her son was going to college. I had never seen this practice before, so I said, oh, let me see what she's going to do. So the secretary came in. He's a really avuncular fellow who I know very well. And he said, what do you need? She said, I need a certificate. So I'm thinking, well, he's going to ask her for some proof. right? To say, show me how you belong to this community. Do you have a relative? He doesn't ask her any of that. And he starts filling it out. And so she says to him, well, don't you want to know who is from this community, whether it's me or my husband? And he says, no, we don't care. But if I give you the certificate, your name will be published in our newsletter, right? So the point he was trying to make is veracity is a fiction. But if you sign on, you will become a part of this community. And then she walked away because she didn't want the history of sexuality. She wanted the compensatory mechanism, which is a certificate, right? So to me, that moment is very interesting, the complete disinterest in veracity, right? Which is you can be part of us, but you have to sign on to the fantasy of this community. So I think that's what the histories of this community, and there are lots more stories like that, which are very, very interesting, right? But I'm writing more now about the histories of slavery that are wrapped up within these communities that are often forgotten, because slavery is still rooted through the black body, right? And the other forms are forgotten. But thank you for your question.
Thank you. Pablo, do you have anything?
I have the last question. I can try. To introduce the next panel, what do you think about that? Is possible to think that the binomial hetero-homo has been reproduced the binomial resistance power? This question is very important because in Latin America, this idea is very important in the idea of transgression. Transgression. What do you think about that? Hetero-homo is like a resistance power.
Well, I think part of the critique I'm making, and I think perhaps Joseph, I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think Joseph is also making in some ways, is that hetero-homo oppositional resistance or normative, non-normative narrative is one that is an effect of things like the Gay International or Westernization. Now remember, the South is as Westernized as the West, right? So Indian intellectuals are doing more damage than the white homos running around India trying to save us, right? So I think the hetero-homo binary doesn't work as effectively in South Asia because of the ways in which gender norms work. So to give you a simple example, I think it is still more difficult for masculine women to come out as women than it is for them to come out as queer, right? So I think the relationship of gender is often lost when we are invested in the hetero-homo, right? So I think that binary, for me, at least in my limited knowledge, doesn't have the same kind of power of intervention as you are suggesting from the context in Latin America and what I know from what I have read. So.
Yo siento que esa crítica es muy clara cuando se habla de contextos contemporáneos.
Claro,
pero
you think
siento
that critique is very clear when you speak of contemporary contexts?
Pero siento que se deshace muy fácilmente en los estudios históricos, sobre todo cuando van al archivo.
It dissolves easily in historical, sorry for the people, but it dissolves easily in historical archives. Sorry, where? It dissolves easily where?
Pero se deshace en los estudios históricos cuando se va al archivo.
It dissolves easier in historical processes, specifically in relationship to the archive.
Porque de cierta forma un poco se hace esta búsqueda de si puede hablar el subalterno.
Because there is this desire to look for the subaltern.
Sorry. Pero in my opinion, I think that this binary is not working in the present either very straightforwardly. For example, I do a lot of work in a completely dilettante way with an HIV organization in India, in southern India, and they have a lot of problem with how to distribute prophylactics because homos are not doing what they're supposed to do. They are code switching, they are, being penetrated and penetrating. So the roles that are the binaries around hetero-homo are not working on the ground, right? And for people who are trying to do very normative work, which is sanctioned by foundations, etc. So it's not just an epistemological or historical account, it's literally a practical problem, a conundrum as well for people on the ground, because this binary doesn't function, because there are people who have sex with men who don't see themselves within the language of that binary at all, right? So I think it's more obvious perhaps when you think about the past, but I think it's just as obvious in the present in sheer practical ways. I don't know if the rest of you would agree, but at least that's what I have noticed quite And bio women tend to disappear very conveniently in all of these stories, right? Which is what I was asking Carlos, that in the periods that Carlos is interested in, if you look at sculptures and paintings in South Asia, those would be replaced by women. It would be women having sex with women, right? In the same kinds of Khajuraho, I mean, I can give you. So that's another discussion for another day, but I think it's important to talk about that, right? One loves the phallus, but, you know, we need a little bit of a break, so, okay.
I wanted just to add sort of the issue of comparison on South America is that, you know, there's also a lot of studies, academic studies, hay muchos estudios académicos sobre Sudamérica that make exactly the same kinds of points about South Asia and the Arab world, right? The idea that men don't adhere to the same kinds, that men who engage in same-sex coitus with other men don't consider themselves homosexuals. There's the famous book on Nicaragua, the whole idea of the bugarrón in the Caribbean, etc. So, and much of that is very much also, I mean, of course, this is complicated by the racial composition of Latin America, that it continues to be ruled by, you know, the descendants of white criollos, and who set the certain sort of kinds of discourse of westernization and of adoption of certain kinds of northern ideas versus sort of the Indians or the blacks or the working classes, etc., which seem to continue to engage in certain kinds of practices that refuse to be identified. And the other thing is the social Darwinist aspect, that you know, the hetero-binary is in fact the modern form of what existed before, and what you find in Latin America or in South Asia or in the Arab world or in Africa are earlier forms, and basically the Gay International and those who adhere to their identities on the ground locally in African countries, in Arab countries, in Latin America, are trying to simply sort of modernize and civilize those who continue to be sort of polymorphously perverse in a world that can no longer accept that. So.
Okay, I think we have to finish here. We go for lunch, and I encourage everyone here to come back at 2 for our next set of presentations with Pete Sigal, Fernanda Molina, and Pablo Bedoya. Please come back, and thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a todos.